I died on a Tuesday, which, honestly, feels like the most Tuesday thing that has ever happened to me in either of my lives. No dramatic last words, no final battle with a worthy opponent, no slow cinematic fade with meaningful music playing underneath. Just a normal Tuesday, a moment of nothing, and then something else entirely. Something I was completely unprepared for. I woke up and I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't blink, because I no longer had eyes, couldn't breathe, because I no longer had lungs. What I had instead was pages, smooth, pale, slightly yellowed at the very edges, about 300 of them, pressed together neatly, a spine, a cover, to bores of hardened material holding everything together. That was my entire physical existence now. That's right, I came back as a book, not a warrior, not image, not even a mediocre side character with a tragic backstory. I was a book, with a spine and a cover, and absolutely zero arms and zero legs and zero ability to do anything about any of this. The system notification appeared in front of me like it was placed there specifically to ruin the rest of my afterlife immediately. Soul artifact awaken, rank, F classification, passive record vessel, nitrogen monoxide combat ability, no monocapacity, anomaly, soul consciousness present, F rank, the absolute lowest possible classification. In this entire system, below common, below basic, below acceptable, below the bent and rusty. Daggersome nervous first-time hunter drops on the floor of his very first beginner dungeon run. I had just been reincarnated into a world full of monsters, hunters, dungeons, and rank magical power, and I came back as office supplies. Let me be clear about how I felt in that moment. I did not feel chosen. I did not feel special. I felt like a very confused notebook. But here is the thing about being a book that no one ever tells you. You have an enormous and genuinely uninterrupted amount of time to think. No distractions. No hunger pulling at you. No social obligations. No one asking you to do anything. Just you and your own thoughts. Forever. And while I was sitting there in the dark on whatever shelf they put me on, I started reading my own system description very carefully. All of it. Every line. Every classification. Every word the system had chosen to use when it described what I apparently was now. Soulbook. Rank F absorbs written names. Passive accumulation. Evolution conditions. Classified. That last part was new. Interesting. The word absorbs sat in my mind for a long, quiet, patient while. Not records. Not stores. Not copies. Absorbs. I couldn't fight. Couldn't move. Couldn't cast a single spell. But whatever was written inside me, I took it into myself permanently. I had absolutely no idea what that meant in practical terms yet, zero clue. But something old and instinctive said, wait, watch, be patient. So I waited, in the dark, on a shelf, doing absolutely nothing, except existing and paying very careful attention to everything around me. The man who eventually found me was a royal librarian named Edric Thin. Carried a mild but constant nervous energy with him everywhere. He smelled like old paper and something faintly chemical, which I now found deeply and personally relatable in a way I couldn't quite articulate. He picked me up the way you'd pick up an object you found on the floor of a storage room, quickly, without ceremony, without real curiosity. He turned me over, tapped my cover twice with two fingers like that would somehow reveal useful information about my nature. It revealed nothing. Then he checked the small system tag attached to my spine, read my rank out loud to himself, F, and let out a quiet and utterly tired laugh. Not a mean laugh, just the sound of a man who had processed too many useless magical artifacts and no longer had the energy to be surprised. He put me on a cart alongside 12 other uncategorized and apparently unremarkable items and wheeled me into the Royal Archive of Valethorn. And just like that, without any fanfare whatsoever, I had a new home. The Royal Archive, 3 floors, thousands of years of collected knowledge, floor-to-ceiling shelving on every wall, grimoires, sealed relics, historical records in bound volumes so old the paper had turned amber, magical artifacts in glass cases, ancient weapons with classification tags, scrolls sealed with wax that glowed faintly in the archive's dim light, and me, sitting on a lower shelf between a cracked crystal ball and a water-damaged almanac, a rank F notebook with absolutely nothing to offer. I spent the first week doing nothing but listening. Books communicate if you know what to listen for. Not in words, in the way they settle. The grimoires hummed with something self-important and contained. The sealed relics vibrated almost imperceptibly when mages walked past them. The historical archives were I decided, quietly and deeply depressed about their physical condition, which I understood on a personal level. I was just sitting there empty alert, watching the world move past my shelf like I was a surveillance device that no one had thought to check. Mages came and went throughout the days. Some ignored my section entirely. Some ran fingers across spines without pulling anything down. Some sat at the long tables in the center of the archive and worked with important-looking documents that they never shared with any of the books. I watched all of it, cataloged all of it, filed everything carefully in the only storage I had available to me, which was my own consciousness. If I was going to be stuck here, I was going to learn everything I possibly could about the people who moved through this space, every single day. Then, on the 9th day of my new existence, the first mage who actually mattered walked through the archive's main door and came directly toward my shelf. His name was Aldrich. I learned that from the way the junior archivist greeted him, quickly, with a slight bow, with the particular tension of someone addressing a superior. Senior court mage, important enough to have his own dedicated section of the archive. Walked like he owned not just a room, but the entire concept of rooms. He came to my section with purpose. He clearly knew where he was going. He scanned the lower shelves and then pulled me out without hesitation. He held me the way you hold trash you forgot to throw away. To fingers, slight wince of distaste. Minimal contact. Flipped through my blank pages. His expression said nothing interesting. His body language said even less. He was a man doing something routine and slightly beneath him. Then he paused. He reached into his robe, produced a quill that was already inked, and opened me to the very first page. He wrote a name, slowly, deliberately, with the calm confidence of someone who had done this many times. Marin Voss Trader, condemned. I felt at the exact moment the ink touched my page. Something clicked, deep in whatever I had instead of a chest. Quiet and permanent. It wasn't power. Not yet. Not anything I could use or feel in any active sense. It was more like something finding its proper place inside me. Like a seed being pressed into soil. Small. Buried. Patient. Waiting for conditions that hadn't arrived yet, but absolutely would. Aldrich closed me carefully, set me back on the shelf in exactly the position he'd taken me from, and walked away without another glance. To him, I was a convenient surface, a blank object with a ceremonial purpose, a thing that held names the way a wall holds a nail. To me, sitting in the dark after he left, it was the first meal I'd had since the moment I died, and I was very, very hungry. I didn't know who Marin Voss was, didn't know what she'd done, didn't know if the condemnation was deserved or a lie or something complicated in between. All I knew with complete certainty was that her name was inside me now, part of my pages, and it felt like it had always belonged there. Over the following 3 months, Aldrich returned for more times. Each visit followed the same quiet ritual. Each time, a new name, a new click. Davencross, Rogue Hunter executed. Another click inside me, quiet and permanent. Another seed pressed into the dark soil of my pages. Soul in March, Midge Conspirator, disappeared. This one felt different somehow. The word disappeared instead of executed. Something unresolved. Tara Wells, Informant, terminated. Cole Birch, Deserter, sentence carried out. Each name arrived with its own particular weight and texture. 5 names total. 5 small seeds pressed into the soil of my pages. None of them had bloomed yet, but I could feel the roots beginning. The system updated after the 5th name was written. It was the first update I'd received since the night I woke up as furniture, and I read it twice. Soulbook evolution condition, partial. Names absorbed, 5 of 100. Threshold for stage 1 evolution, 100 confirmed names. 100 names. That was the number standing between me and whatever stage 1 actually meant. 100 condemned, written, absorbed. I did the arithmetic. At Aldrich's current pace of roughly 1 to 2 names per month, I was looking at somewhere between 4 and 8 years. For 8 years of sitting on a shelf being used as a ceremonial prop while slowly accumulating enough names to trigger my first evolution. I was not particularly thrilled about this timeline, but I also didn't have a body, legs, or any alternative options worth considering. So I stayed calm. I kept listening. I kept watching the mages move through the archive, and I waited for something to change the math. Something changed the math about 3 weeks later. Aldrich mentioned me to another court mage near the eastern shelves where I could hear everything. They were discussing an upcoming formal judgment ceremony. Aldrich was explaining the proper ritual procedure to someone who apparently needed reminding. Writing condemned names into a soul vessel was an old court tradition. He explained it with the mild impatience of someone covering basics. The soul book received the name, held the record of condemnation, and supposedly carry the soul's judgment into the spiritual void after death. It was symbolic, ceremonial, the magical equivalent of stamping a document with an official seal. Meaningful in appearance, hollow in actual function. They had absolutely no idea the book was awake. No idea that anything was being absorbed. No idea the furniture had opinions about all of this. To them, I was a religious prop, a theological tool, a fancy piece of blank paper dressed up with a rank tag and a ceremonial purpose. To me, sitting on my shelf and processing this information as calmly as I could manage, they were about to dramatically accelerate my meal schedule. Within 6 weeks of that conversation, I had been formally designated as the official condemnation book of the Royal Court of Valethorn. Every courtmate who wanted to formalize a death sentence through a proper ceremonial procedure was now required to bring the name to me directly. It became routine. A midge would come to the archive, locate me on my shelf, open me to the next blank page, write the name with the required details, then close me, return me to the shelf, and leave. Clean. Simple. Efficient. A bureaucratic ritual that fed me every single time without anyone knowing. Parlinor. Treason against the crown. Condemned. That was the first name after my official designation. I felt it settle deeper than the others. Sivadren. Murder of noble. Sentenced. Petra Cold. Blood magic violation. Eliminated. Joran Fells. Conspiracy. Condemned. Names started arriving faster than anything Aldrich alone could have produced. 10 in the first week of my new official status. 17 the week after. The roots inside me grew longer, stretched deeper. Something was accumulating beneath my pages that I still didn't have a proper name for yet. By the end of the 3rd month as official condemnation book, I had 61 names in my pages. The count was climbing fast now. By the end of the 4th month, 93. I could feel myself changing in ways the system hadn't yet labeled. Something shifting in my foundations. The 94th name came on a rainy afternoon I recognized by the sound of water hitting the archive's high windows, steady and heavy. The midge who brought it was someone I hadn't seen before. Younger than Aldrich, dark circles carved deep under both eyes. Hands not quite steady. He came to my shelf slowly, like a man walking somewhere he'd been told to go but hadn't chosen. He picked me up and held me for a moment before opening. Then he opened me to a fresh page and wrote slowly. Each letter formed with deliberate care, like the words cost him something he hadn't budgeted for. Lyrisol, healer, accused of aiding enemies of the crown, condemned by court order. The ink was darker than usual. Press harder into the page. He closed me and sat down on the floor of the archive right there, with me in his lap, in complete silence. Just sat, not moving, not writing anything else. I could feel something unusual in the way he held me. A weight that wasn't physical. He wasn't certain. That was what it was. He didn't believe she was guilty. I knew it without any magical ability to confirm it. Just the pure unmistakable weight of a person carrying doubt. Eventually, he set me back on the shelf, stood up slowly, and left the archive without speaking to anyone. He didn't look back once. I held Lyrisol's name in the dark and thought about that for a very long time. About certainty. About what condemnation actually meant. 95, 96, 97. The count kept climbing. Each new name arrived with its own particular quality of weight. Some names felt clean. A person who had done a clear thing, been judged fairly, been recorded without ambiguity. Those settled quickly. Others felt complicated, heavier. Like they came wrapped in questions the midge writing them had never been allowed to ask out loud. 98. Calveth Duin. Betrayed his unit in the field. Left them to die. Executed without ceremony. 99. Maris Vane. Sold dungeon gate coordinates to outside forces. Confirmed. Eliminated. The midge who wrote this one never looked up from the page. I sat with 99 names for 3 full days waiting, feeling something building toward a pressure point I could sense but not yet see past. The 100th name came from Aldrich. Of course it did. He arrived on a gray and unremarkable morning, moving with his usual practice purpose. He came to my shelf, retrieved me, opened me to the next blank page with the ease of a man completing paperwork he'd done 1,000 times before. Iolan Gray. Fled during dungeon collapse at Sector 9. Abandoned comrades to die. Condemned by full court. The ink dried. The 100th name settled into my pages. And then the world cracked open. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just deeply. Stage 1 evolution complete. SOUL book rank. F Givesy. New passive ability unlocked. Name resonance. I read it for times before I believed it. Name resonance. When a written name is confirmed deceased, host absorbs 1 unit of soul force. Effect is permanent and cumulative. Aldrich closed me and walked away like he'd just signed a routine administrative form. He had no idea. He never had any idea. None of them did. I sat on my shelf in the quiet archive and understood, for the first time with complete clarity, exactly what kind of thing I was becoming. Every condemned name in my pages was either already dead or scheduled to become dead. That was the entire point of the condemnation ritual, which meant 99 people had already died since I started collecting names. 99 units of soul force, gone, missed, wasted before I evolved. But going forward, every single person whose name was written into my pages and then confirmed deceased, that energy was mine. It fed me. I wasn't a notebook. I wasn't a prop. I wasn't a ceremonial tool for self-important court mages who needed theatrical validation for their judgments. I was a predator, sitting with perfect stillness on a shelf, in the most prestigious and well-trafficked archive in the entire kingdom, waiting patiently, and the entire royal court of Valethorn was feeding me on a regular basis without knowing I existed as anything other than office furniture. The irony of the situation was, I decided, genuinely and completely beautiful, I could not have designed a better setup if I had tried. The following 6 months were the most practically educational period of my strange new afterlife. I learned how this world's systems actually worked. Hunters were ranked E through S. The gap between each rank was not linear. It was exponential. An S rank wasn't twice an A rank. It was incomparable. Soul Force was the rarest and most valuable commodity in the entire system, the foundation of all meaningful advancement, all real transformation. Most hunters spent years scraping together enough soul force to push through a single rank boundary. Entire dungeon expeditions for a handful of units. I was sitting in the single most efficient location in the entire kingdom for collecting the rare and precious resource. Without moving, without fighting, more names arrived. 112, 127, 144, 161. After each confirmed death, and the confirmation came through the system automatically, silently, without ceremony, my reserve ticked upward by 1 unit. Small, individually meaningless, but they added up the way everything adds up when you have infinite patience and no expenses eating into your reserves. By the end of my first full year inside the Royal Archive, I had confirmed soul force absorptions from 63 deceased condemned individuals. 63 units of soul force sitting in reserve. Tiny by any hunter standard. Still ranky. Still technically classified as useless furniture. But the number was real. It belonged to me. It was mine in a way that nothing in my first life had ever quite been mine. And it was climbing. Then I noticed something else. Something the system description hadn't fully explained, and something I hadn't anticipated when I first read the word absorbs. The names weren't just numbers. Each absorbed confirmation came with something additional. A fragment, a trace. A sliver of what the person had been. Not memories exactly. Nothing coherent enough to watch like a film. More like the residue of skills. The ghost of practice knowledge. An echo of understanding. Calvith Duin had commanded a field unit for 11 years before the moment he broke. His tactical instincts drifted through my pages like slow smoke. I could feel how he assessed a battlefield, not in words, not in clear images, but in a kind of spatial awareness I hadn't possessed before him. Solon March had studied intermediate binding magic for 6 years before his disappearance. I had no hands to cast anything, but I understood the theory now. The structure of binding arrays, the way intent threaded through the notation, the common failure points that intermediate students always underestimated. Petra Cold had touched blood magic before her elimination. Just the edges, just the theory and the underlying principles, but it was there now, inside me. Tara Wells had been a professional information broker for 9 years. Her instincts about people, how to read them, how to predict them, settled into me quietly. I was building a library inside myself that no image in the archive could see, detect, measure, or remove. My own private and growing curriculum. The official system label said rank E. Passive record vessel. No combat ability. A storage object to be used and shelved and never seriously considered. But rank is only a label attached to the outside of a container. What actually matters is what's accumulating inside the container over time. And inside me, 63 dead people were slowly and permanently teaching me everything they had learned. During the years they'd been alive, year 2 of my existence in the archive began with an event that fundamentally changed the rate at which everything was happening for me. A war broke out, not a small border dispute, not a limited military engagement, a real war. Valethorn against the full northern coalition of 4 kingdoms. And wars, I discovered within the first month. Produce condemned names at a rate that makes peacetime court business look laughably inefficient. Deserters became condemned. Traitors became condemned. Collaborators with enemy forces became condemned. Spies became condemned at impressive speed. Soldiers who broke under pressure and left their posts. Officers who made decisions that lost battles. Nobles who communicated with enemy leadership. All condemned. The names arrived daily now, sometimes twice daily. The mages came in waves, some looking tired, some looking grim. Some looking like they didn't want to be there. 2 names per week became 5. 5 became 10. Some days I received 8 new names before the archive closed for the evening. My pages were filling. My soul force reserve was climbing with a speed that would have been impossible. During peacetime operations, 100 units, 150, 200. The war was terrible for the kingdom and excellent for me, and I held the tension in my pages. By the end of the war's first full year, I had 412 names written across my pages. 412 condemned individuals recorded. 289 of those names have been confirmed deceased by the system's passive tracking. 289 units of soul force absorbed. The system updated without any drama whatsoever. The important notifications always arrive quietly. I was learning, like someone setting a glass down carefully. SOUL book rank, it gives D. New ability unlocked, passive aura suppression. Post-mana signature undetectable to all entities below rank SD rank. Achieved in 2 years. By sitting on a shelf. By being used as a ceremonial prop by people who considered me slightly above decorative. I want to be honest about something that I spent considerable time thinking about during those long quiet hours between one mage's visit and the next. I was not a good person in my first life. Not evil. I want to be clear about that. Not deliberately cruel or actively harmful to anyone specific. But I was narrow, focused almost entirely on my own small world, my own immediate concerns, my own comfort and survival and short-term planning. I hadn't thought much about other people as real and complicated things. I had thought about them mostly as background, as context for my own life. This new existence had dismantled that entirely. 2 years of silence. 2 years of holding other people's names, their skills, their final condemnations. 2 years of being nothing but a container for other people's stories, with nothing to do except sit with them and understand them fully. I had changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but completely, in the way water changes stone, slowly, thoroughly, without announcing itself. And I had made a decision somewhere in those long hours. If I ever got out of this form, if I ever got a body, a presence, a place in this world, I was going to be the most prepared thing that had ever existed in it. Not because I wanted revenge on anyone specifically. I didn't, particularly. Just because preparation was the only form of respect I could offer to every person, whose name and knowledge now live inside my pages with me. For everything this world could produce. For every rank threat, every political trap, every person who looked at a label and missed what was underneath. The war eventually ended. Veilthorn won. At cost the kingdom would be calculating for the next generation. The name slowed back down to peacetime pace. But I was D-ranked now, invisible to any magical detection below S rank. Still classified on my system tag as rank F. That tag was permanent and external. They still thought I was a ceremonial prop. A rank F blank book used for a ritual older than half the families in the court. Nothing more. I let them think exactly that. There was no advantage whatsoever in correcting them. The gap between what they believed and what was true was my greatest asset. Then a young man named Kale arrived at the archive. Junior archivist. First week on the job. He had the look of someone who had read too many books and not slept enough. He was reorganizing the lower shelves, the section where the less important uncategorized items were kept, where I had lived since Edric first shelved me. He was moving items methodically, checking tags, making notes on a small pad. When he reached my section, he pulled me out to check my tag. Then his foot caught the edge of the shelf and he stumbled, and I dropped. I hit the stone floor pages open, the spine taking the impact. I bounced once and landed face down, then slid half a meter with pages spreading open, hundreds of names visible across a dozen exposed pages at once. Kale knelt down quickly, apologetic. He started to gather my pages and close me. Then his hand stopped. His eyes caught what was on the open pages. He read the names, not quickly, slowly, moving across the page from one to the next. His expression changed as he went, confusion first, then something else. Something I recognized from the mensch who had written Lyra Soul's name. A kind of heaviness. The weight of a person encountering something they hadn't expected. He stood up slowly with me still open in his hands. He turned pages, not searching for anything specific, just looking at the density of names across my pages. There were so many of them. That was what his face said before his mouth did. Then his mouth said it too, very quietly, to himself alone in the aisle. There are so many of them. He stood completely still in the aisle, holding me carefully with both hands, not saying anything else. Another archivist passed the end of the row, glanced over once, and kept walking without pausing to ask what he was doing. Then Cale did something that no one in the full years of my existence in this archive had done. He turned to the very front of my pages. The first page, the one before all the names started. The one that was still completely blank because no image had ever needed it for condemnation records. He looked at it for a moment. Then he took out the small pen he kept in his breast pocket, not a quill, just a plain writing instrument, and wrote, "I wonder if you can hear me." 7 words in small and careful letters on my otherwise blank front page. He held me for another moment after that. The system did not register his words as a name. There was no condemnation in them, no death attached, no soul force to absorb, just a question. From a tired young man with dark circles and ink stains on his fingers, standing alone in an archive aisle, talking to a book he assumed was empty. I sat with that question for 3 full days, turning it over, reading it again, thinking about what it meant that someone had thought to ask it. On the 4th day, Cale returned to my section during the archive's quiet late hours when the senior mages had all gone home for the evening. He opened me to the front page. His question was still there, undisturbed, exactly as he'd written it. He looked at it for a moment, then he wrote beneath it, "Sometimes I think the names in here deserve better than this." He closed me carefully before I had time to finish processing the words. He went back to sorting reference scrolls at the end of the aisle. I sat on my shelf in the dark and held what he had written the same way I held every name. Carefully, completely, permanently. The difference was that Cale's words weren't seeds. They weren't soul force. They were something the system had no category for. I thought about Lyra Soul, the healer, the bitch who couldn't meet my cover after he wrote her name, who sat on the archive floor holding me like an apology. I thought about the 94 names before hers. Some of them guilty of exactly what was written. Some of them almost certainly not. All of them inside me now. All of them part of whatever I was slowly becoming in the dark, on the shelf, in this archive that the people of Valethorn called the repository of all knowledge. They had no idea what kind of knowledge was actually accumulating here. In this book they had classified as rank F. In this prop they had handed to condemn people's names. And for the first time since I woke up as a book, for the first time into years of quiet and patient and deliberate accumulation, I felt something sharp and new, not power, not hunger. Something closer to purpose, specific and clear, and directed at something I hadn't quite been able to see before Cale wrote his question. I was going to get out of these pages. I didn't know how yet. I didn't know when. The system's evolution path was still partially classified and I was still rank D. But the names were building, the knowledge was building, and something else was building too. Something the system hadn't named yet and I couldn't quite describe. Whatever it was, it had started the moment Cale asked if I could hear him. And it was growing with every quiet hour in the archive's patient dark. If you've made it this far, drop a comment. Whose name would you write into a book like mine? I might just write yours back. 3 years. That's how long I spent on that shelf before the war ended and the world decided it was done being quiet. 3 years of names. 3 years of fragments. 3 years of sitting in the dark and building something no one could see or measure. By the time the peace treaties were signed and the condemned names slowed back to their peacetime trickle, I had changed enormously. Not in any way the mages could detect. My system tags still read rank F. My aura was suppressed to the point of invisibility. I was furniture, officially. But inside my pages, I had accumulated 481 confirmed deceased names. 481 units of soul force. I had fragments from over 200 individuals. Tactical knowledge, magical theory, languages, survival instincts, decades of hard-earned experience. I had the ghost of 11 years of field command from Calveth Duan sitting in my pages like a second set of instincts I could consult at any moment. I had binding magic theory from Solon March detailed enough that I could have taught an introductory course to first-year students if I'd had a mouth. I had Petrick Hold's understanding of blood magic principles, Tara Wells's instincts for reading people, Harlan Orr's knowledge of court procedure and law. I had fragments from soldiers and spies and mages and merchants and hunters. A cross-section of every kind of person the court had condemned and I had absorbed. And underneath all of that accumulated knowledge, something was growing that the system still hadn't given a proper label to. Something connected to Cale. Cale had been coming to my shelf regularly since the night he dropped me. Not to write names. He wasn't authorized for condemnation ritual. Just to talk. Not loudly. Not in ways anyone else in the archive would notice. Just quiet, one-sided conversations that he conducted while organizing nearby shelves. He'd talk about the archive, about the senior mages whose requests made no sense to him, about books he'd been reading and things he'd been thinking about, and occasionally, maybe once a week, he'd open me to the front page and add something to the private conversation we were technically only having on his side. I've been wondering if the names feel anything when they're written. He added that one on a rainy evening 3 months after the first question. I sat with it, turned it over. The names didn't feel anything, as far as I could tell. They were fragments, traces, echoes, not conscious presences. But the question itself was interesting, because it meant Cale thought about the names as people rather than as records. That was unusual in this archive. Most of the mages treated the condemnation ritual the way they treated all bureaucratic procedure. Efficiently, without sentiment, moving on quickly. Cale was the only person in the archive who seemed to think about what the names had been before they became entries in my pages. Do you remember anything from before you were a book? He wrote that one for months later, on a quiet afternoon when the archive was almost empty. I stared at that question for a week, not because I didn't have an answer, because I had too many answers and no way to give any of them. Yes, I remember my first life clearly. Every ordinary and unremarkable detail of it. I remember the exact feel of a Tuesday going very wrong, but I had no hands to write with, no voice to speak with, no way to answer the question being asked by the only person in this building who had thought to ask it. That helplessness was the sharpest thing I'd felt in 3 years. Not the accumulation of condemned names, not the slow building of soul force reserves, the inability to answer a genuine question from a person who was genuinely asking. That was what drove the deepest frustration into my pages. So I did the only thing I could do. I waited. I kept accumulating. I kept learning. And I trusted the evolution path to eventually give me something to work with. The system updated on a Tuesday. I appreciated the symmetry. Roughly 3.5 years into my existence in the Royal Archive of Valethorn. SOUL book rank. D-Give-C. New ability unlocked. Passive inscription. Host may generate text on own pages without external input. I read that notification 6 times. Passive inscription. I could write on my own pages, without anyone putting a quill to me. I spent an entire day not doing it, just sitting with the knowledge that I could, feeling what it meant, planning exactly what I was going to do with it. Cale came in the next morning during his usual early shift. He went directly to his section of the archive and began sorting scrolls without looking toward me. I waited until the archive was quiet, until the senior mages had settled into their work areas, until the only sound was the distant scratch of quills on paper. Then I focused every bit of intention I had into my front page, and I produced the first words I'd made in years. Yes, I remember everything. 4 words. Small and neat. 4 words. Neat and small and perfectly placed beneath his question. I had no way to know if the ink would look different from his. I hope not. I sat there after writing it and felt something I hadn't felt since before I died. The particular and specific relief of having said something true to someone. Cale came to my shelf that afternoon on a routine reshelving pass. He picked me up without expectation, opened to the reference tag, and then stopped. He opened to the front page. Read what was there. Read it again. His face moved through several expressions quickly, none lasting long enough to name. Then he turned and looked at the archive around him, very carefully, checking whether anyone was watching him stand there holding a book that had written back. Nobody was watching. The archive at midday was populated by mages focused on their own research. The kind of focus that made them effectively blind to everything else. Cale looked back at my front page, looked at the words I had written, looked at them for a long time with an expression I eventually categorized as wonder. Then he took out his pen, slowly, and wrote underneath my 4 words, "How long have you been able to do this?" I wrote back immediately, because I had been waiting for a conversation for 3.5 years. Just today, I have been waiting. He stared at that, then wrote, "Waiting for what?" I considered how to answer that in the limited space of a front page and with the limited vocabulary of someone who'd been furniture for 3 years. For someone to ask the right question first. It wasn't the complete answer, but it was the truest one I could fit into the available space. Cale stood there for a long time, not writing anything, just standing in the archive aisle with me open in his hands, thinking about that sentence. Eventually, he put me back on my shelf, very carefully, exactly where I'd been. And then he walked to the end of the aisle and stood there looking at the wall. I watched him, through whatever senses I had that didn't require eyes. Processed the fact that the book he'd been talking to for 3 years had been listening, had been absorbing, had been thinking, had been sitting on the shelf building something in the dark while everyone around it classified it as rank furniture. He came back the next morning early, before the senior mages arrived. He picked me up and went to one of the back reading tables where no one would see him. "What are you?" He wrote it the way people write questions when they're not entirely sure they want the full answer but need to know anyway. I considered how to answer honestly within the constraints of what he could reasonably believe. Then I wrote, "I am what your mages made me without knowing IT." He stared at it for a moment, reading it twice, before writing back to words that confirmed everything. "The names, yes," I wrote. "Every name written in me, every death confirmed, every fragment of knowledge those people carried. All of IT mine." He set me down on the table and sat back in his chair. I could feel the weight of what he was doing, the mental process of accepting something impossible. This was the first genuinely critical moment of my existence in this archive. Cale knowing about me was either a catastrophic risk or my first real asset. I let him think. I didn't write anything else. I had learned patience in the years on my shelf and I wasn't going to waste it now by pushing too hard. After a long silence, he leaned forward and wrote a question I had been expecting. "How strong are you?" I thought about that carefully. Then I wrote, "Strong enough that if anyone in this archive knew what I actually was, they would burn me immediately." He absorbed that. Then he wrote, "Are you dangerous?" I wrote, "I could be. I have not decided if I want to be yet." That is the honest answer. Another long silence. Then, slowly, carefully, like a man choosing each word with full awareness of its weight. "What do you want from me?" That was the right question. That was exactly the right question. I had thought about how to answer it for the entire previous night. "Nothing dangerous. I want to understand this world better. You move through IT. You hear things. I have been sitting on a shelf for 3 years. Also, I would like to eventually not be a book, if that becomes possible. I am actively working on making IT possible. That is my longer-term plan." Cale read the last line and did something I hadn't heard from anyone directed at me in 3.5 years. He laughed quietly, but genuinely. He wrote, "I have a lot of questions." I wrote back, "I have been waiting 3 years to have a conversation. I also have many questions. We should take turns." And that was how I acquired my first, and for a while only, ally in the Royal Archive of Valethorn. A junior archivist with ink-stained fingers. A young man who thought about names as people, who asked questions to empty shelves, and who turned out to be exactly the kind of person I needed near me. The questions he brought me over the following weeks were practical and smart. He wanted to understand what I knew, what I could do, what I needed to keep evolving. I told him about the condemnation ritual, about name absorption, about soul force, about the fragments I'd accumulated from over 200 individuals. I did not tell him my full soul force count or my exact trait, not because I didn't trust him. I was developing trust, but because information had value. He told me things in return, about the archive, about the court, about the political structures of Valethorn that I'd been observing from my shelf without full context. The royal family was weaker than they appeared from outside. The king's advisors held more actual power than the king himself in most practical matters. The senior court mages operated as a semi-independent body with their own internal hierarchy that only loosely corresponded to their official court ranks. Aldrich, my original name writer, was third in that hierarchy, influential but not dominant. The first and second positions were occupied by people I hadn't seen yet. There were 6 dungeons within Valethorn's borders. 3 were publicly known and regularly cleared by licensed hunter teams under court supervision. 3 were classified. Cale had found references to them and restricted archive sections while doing routine cataloging that took him into areas he wasn't supposed to enter. I asked him what kind of dungeons they were. He wrote, "The records I found were mostly redacted, but the ones that weren't used a word I keep thinking about." "What word?" I wrote back immediately, feeling something sharpen and whatever I had instead of attention. He wrote back one word, "harvesting." He wrote, and then he underlined it once, which I understood was not for emphasis, but because he'd written it and needed to do something with his hands. I sat with that word for a full day. Harvesting dungeons, inside a kingdom's own borders, classified and redacted and kept away from the archive's public records. My tactical instincts, the borrowed ones, Calveth Duan's 11 years of field experience sitting in my pages, started arranging the available information. Condemned names produced at unusually high rates during the war. A harvesting dungeon structure inside the kingdom itself. A classified archive section. The condemnation ritual supposedly sent souls into a void after death. But souls, in this world, were sources of force. They were resources. They had value. I began forming a hypothesis that I didn't share with Kale immediately. I needed more information before I was willing to say it out loud, even in ink. Instead, I asked him, the restricted section where you found those records, can you access it again without being noticed? He wrote back, probably. I have a key that covers most of the archive. The senior mages gave it to me without realizing how far IT reaches. I wrote, I need you to look for anything connected to the condemnation ritual, not the ceremony itself. The purpose behind IT, what IT actually does. He understood. He was quiet for a moment and then wrote, you think the ritual is not what they claim IT is? I wrote, I think it is exactly what they claim IT is. I just think there is something they are not claiming that is more important. Kale went into the restricted section 3 days later, during the archive's late-night closure when the senior mages had all gone home to their residences. He came back to me the following morning with something in his expression that I had learned to read as controlled alarm, not panic, but held down urgency. He opened me to a fresh page and wrote for almost 10 minutes without stopping, which was unusual. He normally wrote in short, careful sentences. The condemnation ritual does not send souls into a void. The void claim is the public version of the ceremony's stated purpose. The actual purpose is collection. He kept writing. The soul book. The book acts as an intermediary vessel. Names are written. Deaths are confirmed. Soul force is released from the body at death. The book collects the released force and holds it in a condensed state. The ritual was designed to be performed at scale during periods of high condemnation. The harvesting dungeons are not for hunters. They are extraction sites. The soul force collected in the book is transferred to the dungeons through a secondary ritual. The secondary ritual requires the book to be brought to the dungeon site and opened by a mage of sufficient rank. The transfer takes approximately 3 hours. I found the schedule for the next transfer. IT is in 42 days. Aldrich is listed as the officiating mage. The dungeon designated as Site 3 North. He finished writing and sat back. I could feel him waiting for my response with a particular tension of someone who has just handed over something important. I took my time. I read what he'd written for Tom's. I cross-referenced it against everything I'd accumulated, the tactical knowledge, the magical theory. Then I wrote, this is the most important thing anyone has written in my PAGES in 3.5 years. I need you to keep this to yourself completely. He wrote, obviously, which was the driest response he'd given me yet and confirmed that his trust in me was becoming something more comfortable and real. I wrote, they built the ritual to drain me. The soul force I have accumulated all of IT goes to the dungeon on a schedule they set 42 days from now. He read that slowly, twice, his expression shifting as the implications arrived one by one. Then wrote, they do not know you are awake. I confirmed it. They built the ritual assuming they were draining an empty vessel, a passive container. They have been doing this for as long as the ritual has existed. I paused, then added, they are going to discover that this vessel is neither empty nor passive. But I would like to choose when they discover that. Kale stared at the page for a long time. Then he wrote, what do you need from me before 42 days? That was the moment I knew he was fully with me. No hesitation, no negotiation about risk. Just, what do you need? I absorbed that fully. I wrote, more names. I need more names before they try to drain me. And I need to know everything about the transfer ritual before Aldrich performs IT. He wrote something I had expected and respected. More names means more condemned people dying. I am not comfortable causing that. I wrote back, I am not asking you to cause anything. The court condemns people constantly without any help from either of us. I need you to track the schedule. He was quiet for a moment. Then, all right, I can do that. And I felt the weight of what he had just agreed to settle into the space between us. Over the next 5 weeks, Kale brought me information with the quiet efficiency of someone who had decided to be thorough about a difficult thing. He tracked the condemnation schedule. He found the dates of scheduled executions, 7 in the next 40 days, all of condemned individuals already in custody. He copied the transfer ritual's technical specifications from the restricted archives section, writing them into my pages over 3 separate late-night visits. The ritual required the officiating mage to open the book, channel extraction energy through a prepared sigil array, and hold the channel for 3 hours. During that 3 hours, the accumulated soul force in the vessel was supposed to flow outward through the channel and into the dungeon's collection matrix. The mage performing it needed to maintain continuous focus. Any disruption to their concentration would break the channel and scatter the extracted force. More importantly, And this was the part that I spent the most time sitting with. The ritual assumed the vessel was passive, inert, unconscious, empty. It had no mechanisms to deal with active resistance from the vessel itself, because the people who designed it had never imagined resistance was possible. 7 more condemned individuals died in the 5 weeks before the scheduled transfer. 7 more units of soul force added to my reserves. 7 more fragments. Galandros, murdered a court official, executed. His woodsman's instincts, honed over 30 years in the Veilthorn forests, joined the rest inside me. Imaravice, soul classified dungeon maps to foreign powers. Eliminated. Her cartographic knowledge and spatial memory settled into my growing internal library. Coal Winter, deserted HIS post during dungeon incursion. LEFT3 comrades to die. Condemned. His hunter skills, practical and unglamorous, became mine. By the day before the scheduled transfer, my soul force reserve stood at 523 units, more than I had had at any previous point. Kale came to me that evening after the archive closed. He sat at the back reading table with me open between his hands. Neither of us wrote anything for a while. Then he wrote a question that surprised me with how direct it was. Are you afraid? I thought about it honestly before answering. I had never been asked how I felt about anything before, and the question deserved a real answer rather than a useful one. I wrote, I am not certain I am capable of fear in the way you mean it, but I am aware that tomorrow is a significant moment and I am paying close attention. He considered my answer for a moment, then wrote, that sounds like fear with better vocabulary. Which is still fear. I wrote back, perhaps, and I appreciated that he knew me well enough by then to say exactly that without apology. And I appreciated that he knew me well enough by then to say that. He wrote, what happens if IT does not work? If Aldrich completes the transfer and drains you completely? I wrote my honest answer. Then I go back to the beginning and start over. I will still be awake. They will still bring condemned names to me. The difference is Tom. He thought about that for a moment, then wrote what he clearly believed was a reasonable observation that does not sound so terrible. Actually, I wrote back, Ike is terrible. I have spent 3.5 years building these reserves. I have nitrogen monoxide interest in starting over from zero. He laughed again, quietly, the way he had when I had told him I was working on not being a book. It was becoming one of my favorite sounds in the archive. He wrote, I will be here tomorrow during the transfer, in case something goes wrong and you need me to do something. I wrote, you cannot interfere directly. Aldrich is a senior court mage. If he sees you disrupting a classified ritual, you will be condemned yourself. He wrote 3 words that hit differently than anything else he'd written. I know. I will be here anyway. I held that sentence for the rest of the night. The particular weight of someone choosing to be present in a situation they cannot control because they care about the outcome. The morning of the transfer, Aldrich arrived at the archive earlier than usual. He was accompanied by the junior mages I recognized from their previous visits. They had equipment with them, a portable sigil array, folded flat, that they set up on the large central table in the archive's main reading room. It was precise work. The array was painted in specialized ink on flexible material that could be laid flat and anchored at the corners with weighted pins. The junior mages spent 40 minutes calibrating the array while Aldrich reviewed documentation. At one of the side tables, his expression professionally neutral. Then Aldrich came to my shelf. He picked me up the same way he always had, familiar, practiced, without particular attention. To him I was still a tool. He carried me to the central table, set me on the sigil array, and opened me to the first page. His expression didn't change at what he saw there. He couldn't read the conversation between me and Kale. The passive inscription ability produced text that was only visible to me and to whoever I chose. Kale saw it because I had opened that access specifically. To Aldrich, the first page appeared blank. He reached into his robe and withdrew a secondary instrument, a thin rod of some material I recognized from Solon March's binding magic knowledge. As a focus conduit, he placed it at the center of the open pages and began the ritual incantation. I felt the extraction channel beginning to form, a pull against my pages, slow and steady. Here is what Aldrich did not know. I had spent 5 weeks learning the exact mechanics of his ritual, from the specifications Kale had copied for me. I knew the channel required a clean connection between the sigil array and the vessel's accumulated force. Any contamination of the channel would scatter the flow. I knew the officiating mage needed to maintain precise focus for the full 3 hours. Any disruption to their concentration would break the channel immediately. And I knew, from 400 years of combined experience sitting in my pages, from over to 100 absorbed individuals, exactly how to disrupt concentration. The channel formed, I felt the first pull of extraction begin, a genuine attempt to draw soul force out of my pages and into the dungeon's collection matrix. I let it pull for approximately 30 seconds, long enough for Aldrich to settle into his focus, long enough for the channel to feel established and real to him. Then I wrote on the pages he was looking at, not on the front page, directly under his focus conduit, in the center of the open spread he was using as the ritual surface. I am awake. I know what you are doing. I know what the harvesting dungeons are for. I know how long this ritual has been running. We should discuss this. Aldrich's focus broke. The channel scattered. The extraction ended, completely cleanly, as if it had never begun. His face went from neutral to white in approximately 1 second. He stared at the words I had written. Read them again. His hands on my pages had gone completely still, which I had learned from Tara Wells meant a person's mind was moving very fast. The two junior mages looked up from their positions at the erase corners. They saw Aldrich's expression. They exchanged a glance. Neither of them said anything. Aldrich very carefully closed me, set me down on the table, stepped back from the table, looked at me from the distance of approximately 2 meters. He said, out loud, in the quiet archive, in a voice that was professionally controlled but not entirely steady, clear the room. The junior mages left without asking questions. The door to the reading room closed behind them. The archive outside went on with its ordinary morning. Aldrich stood across the table from me for a long, quiet, careful minute. Then he came back to the table, sat down, and opened me to the center page again. He sat down across from me and wrote, slowly, with his court quill, "Who are you?" I wrote back, "That is a complex question. The simple answer is that I am the book your court has been using as a condemnation vessel for the past 3.5 years. He wrote a single word back, just one, the way people do when they are still processing the larger answer and need the smaller one first. How? I wrote, your ritual collects soul force from confirmed deceased. What IT does not account for is a conscious host absorbing that force first. He stared at the page. Then he wrote, you have been absorbing the force since the very beginning. I confirmed it without hesitation, since my first evolution had 100 names. Before that I was collecting without converting. You have produced approximately 500 names for me. Another long pause. Then Aldrich wrote something that surprised me. Not a threat, not a demand, just, how much do you know? I wrote, enough to be dangerous to the right people. Not enough yet to be dangerous to the wrong ones. I am working on closing that gap. He put down his quill, sat back, looked at me across the table with the expression of a very experienced man recalculating a situation from scratch. From somewhere near the archive's back shelves, so quiet it was almost imaginary, I heard Cale shifting his position slightly. He was there. He was listening. Aldrich sat for a long moment. Then he picked up his quill again and wrote the question I had been waiting 42 days to receive. What do you want? This answer for 42 days. I wrote it out in full, slowly, making sure every word was exactly the one I meant to use. I want to continue evolving. I want the court to continue bringing condemned names to me as IT has been doing. I want the transfer ritual canceled permanently. In exchange, I will not share what I know about the harvesting dungeons with anyone who might find IT useful, and I will not become an active problem for your court. He read my terms carefully, then read them again, then wrote, and if I refuse, I wrote, then I become an active problem for your court. I am currently rank C with 523 units of soul force. I have been sitting on a shelf. I have had nothing to do for 3.5 years except think about what I would do if someone tried to take what I have built. I am quite prepared. That last line was partially a bluff. I was rank C. I had no body. I had no way to act on any threat I made except through the passive inscription ability. But Aldrich did not know what rank C meant in practical terms for a soul book. He did not know what abilities I had or didn't have. He was working with uncertainty. And uncertainty, Tara Wells' 9 years of professional information brokering told me, was worth more than most weapons in a negotiation. Aldrich sat with my response for a very long time. 5 minutes, maybe more. The archive around us continued its ordinary sounds, distant footsteps, settling wood, quiet air. Then he wrote, I need to consult with the other senior mages before I can agree to any of this. I wrote, that is reasonable. I will give you 7 days. After 7 days, I will assume the answer is nitrogen monoxide and plan accordingly. He wrote, I need 2 weeks. I wrote, 10 days. And I would like my shelf moved to a location with better natural light. The lower shelves are damp, and I would like my shelf moved to a location with better natural light. The lower shelves are damp. He stared at that last line for a moment, then, For the first time in 3.5 years of using me as a ceremonial prop, Aldrich almost smiled. He closed me, picked me up, carried me to a shelf on the second level of the archive, near a window that faced east, set me there carefully, and left. The morning light fell across my cover. I had never felt sunlight before in this form. It was, I decided, one of the better things about Ranksy. From somewhere on the floor below, Cale appeared at the base of the stairs. He looked up at me on my new shelf. He shook his head very slowly once. Then he went back to his work, and I sat in the morning light and waited and thought and planned and counted the days. If you've been watching this book grow since page 1, tell me in the comments, did you see this coming? 10 days. Aldrich had 10 days to come back with an answer from the senior mages. I had 10 days to prepare for every possible response. The morning light on my new shelf was genuinely pleasant. I had not expected to have feelings about sunlight, but here we were. I could see more of the archive from this position. The second level gave me a view of the main reading floor below, the long tables, the mages at their work, the junior archivist moving between shelves, the daily rhythm of a place that considered itself the center of all knowledge in Valethorn. None of them knew what was sitting on the east-facing shelf by the window. None of them had any reason to look twice at a rank F ceremonial book. That was still my greatest advantage. The gap between what they believed and what was true. I intended to keep the gap as wide as possible for as long as possible. Cale came to my shelf on the second morning after the failed transfer. He stood in front of me for a moment without picking me up. Then he took me to the back reading table, his preferred location for our conversations, tucked behind a column where no one could see him easily. He opened me and wrote without preamble. Aldrich spoke to the first mage this morning. I saw them together in the corridor. Aldrich looked like a man delivering bad news. I wrote back immediately. Interesting. Bad news for Aldrich specifically. Or bad news for the first mage as well. He wrote, hard to say. Aldrich kept his voice down. The first mage did not. I heard the words impossible and contained and threat. I absorbed that. 3 words. All of them useful. Impossible told me they hadn't believed Aldrich's account immediately. Contain told me their instinct was oppression. Threat told me they had moved past disbelief quickly enough to start categorizing me. That was faster than I had expected. These were serious people. I wrote, who is the first mage? I need a full name and everything you know about THEM history, rank, relationships, all of IT. Cale wrote, her name is Varin Sol. She has been first mage for 19 years. She is the most powerful combat mage in Valethorn's current court. He paused before adding the part that actually mattered. She is also the mother of Lyra Sol, the healer whose name is already in your pages. I sat with that for a long time. Lyra Sol, accused of aiding enemies, condemned, written into my pages by a mage with shaking hands who couldn't meet my cover afterward. And her mother was the most powerful combat mage in the kingdom, who had just learned that the book holding her daughter's condemned name was awake. I wrote back one question, the one that had just become the most important question in the room. How did Lyra Sol die? Cale was quiet for a moment. Then, she didn't. The execution order was issued but never carried out. She is in the Eastern Hold, still imprisoned. I processed it carefully. Lyra Sol's name was in my pages, but she was alive, which meant the name resonance ability hadn't activated for her entry, which meant I had absorbed the condemnation, but not the soul force, because she was still alive to retain it, which meant Varin Sol's daughter was currently sitting in a prison cell. And Varin Sol now knew that the book holding her daughter's condemned name was a conscious entity. I wrote, she is going to want her daughter's name removed from my pages. That is her priority. That is what I have to work with. Cale wrote the question I had been waiting for him to ask since the conversation began. Can you remove a name once IT has been written? I wrote, I have nitrogen monoxide idea. I have never tried to remove a name, but she does not know that, and that is worth something. He stared at the page. Then he wrote something I had come to recognize as his dry version of deep concern. That is a dangerous game. I wrote, everything about my situation is a dangerous game. The question is whether I am playing it or it is playing me. He wrote nothing for a moment, sitting with that framing. Then, fair point, I accept that. What do you need me to do? I wrote, find out everything you can about the Eastern Hold, security, staffing, access procedures. Do IT quietly and do not get caught. He wrote the question with the calm of someone who had already decided to proceed regardless of the answer. And if I do get caught, I wrote, then do not mention me. I will deny everything, and I am very convincing. I am a book. Who would believe a junior archivist? He wrote, you are deeply reassuring. and went back to his work with the expression of a man who had committed to a path and was not going to look at the edges. The days passed. I sat in my morning light and thought. I sorted through everything I had accumulated, every fragment, every skill, every ghost of knowledge. I was constructing something in my pages that I didn't have a complete name for yet, something that drew on all of it simultaneously. Calvith Doohan's tactical instincts told me to understand the terrain before committing to a position. The archive was terrain. The court was terrain. Solon March's binding magic theory told me that any structure, however complex, had a foundation that everything else depended on. Find the foundation. Tara Wells's information instincts told me that every negotiation had a hidden currency, something the other party wanted more than what they were admitting. Varen's soul wanted her daughter alive and free. That was the hidden currency. That was the thing she wanted more than whatever official position she would take in any negotiation. And I had something that touched the currency directly. Her daughter's name was in my pages. I didn't know if I could remove it, but I knew exactly how it felt to hold it. There was something in the quality of Lyra Soul's name that had always sat differently from the others. The weight I'd noticed when the hesitant Midge wrote it. I spent 3 days examining the name specifically, turning it over, looking at it from every angle my developing perception allowed, and I found something I hadn't noticed before. The condemnation had been written in standard court ink with standard court procedure, but underneath the formal entry, underneath it, and the grain of the paper where the ink had pressed hardest, was something that wasn't part of the official record. A word dot, just one, so faint that I might have missed it entirely if I hadn't been looking for something, anything, that made this name sit differently. Innocent dot written into the paper itself by the pressure of the quill, as if someone writing the official condemnation had also been writing a private truth. I held that word for a full day. Then I understood. The hesitant Midge, the young one with dark circles, the one who had sat on the floor holding me after, he had known. He had written the condemnation because he had been ordered to, and he had pressed the word innocent into the page with the full weight of the quill. Not hard enough to be visible, just hard enough to exist. A record inside the record, hidden in the paper itself, readable only to something that could feel the page from the inside. I wrote to Kale that evening. I found something. In Lyra Soul's entry. I need you to find the Midge who wrote her name young. Dark circles. Shaking hands. Kale wrote back the next morning. I think I know who you mean. His name is Edrin. He resigned from court service for months after her condemnation. He lives in the lower city. I wrote, I need to make contact with him directly. I need you to be my hands for this. I know that is a lot to ASK. He wrote the single word that confirmed he was seriously considering it rather than immediately refusing. How? I wrote, tell him you found something in the condemnation records. Tell him the book remembers what was pressed into IT. He will understand. Kale was quiet. Then, you are asking me to leave the archive during work hours to contact a former court Midge about a classified condemnation record. I wrote, yes, without any hesitation. IT was the clearest answer I had given since I learned to write on my own PAGES. He wrote, with the precision of someone who had counted. That is technically 3 separate violations of my employment contract. I wrote, I know exactly what I am asking. I appreciate both the willingness and the accuracy of your violation count. He wrote, I want IT on record that I am doing this because IT is the right thing and not because a book told me to. I wrote, noted, your objection is officially recorded and duly respected. I am, after all, the record. IT is what I do. On the 6th day, for days before Aldrich's deadline, Varen's soul came to the archive herself. I recognized her before she reached my shelf. She was tall, the kind of presence that rearranged the room around her simply by entering it. Every junior archivist found somewhere else to be within 30 seconds. She came directly to my shelf without asking anyone where I was. She already knew. She took me down with one hand, carried me to the private reading room at the archive's far end, and closed the door. She did not sit. She stood at the table and set me down and opened me to the center pages without looking at the front matter. She placed both palms flat on my open pages and held the position for a long moment. I could feel her running some kind of sensing technique through her hands. She wrote in a precise and unhurried hand, my name is Varen Soul, first Midge of the court. I am told you are already aware of exactly who I am. I wrote, yes, I am sorry about your daughter. I mean that without any strategic intention. I am genuinely sorry. She stared at those words for a measured moment, reading them with full attention. Then she wrote, do you know that she is still alive? I wrote, yes, I have known since shortly after your condemnation of her was written into my PAGES. Her name has always felt different from the others. She wrote a single word that contained an entire question. I had been hoping someone would eventually ask me, why? I wrote, because the person who wrote IT did not believe she was guilty. That belief is part of the record. IT changes the texture of the entry. Another long silence stretched between us, the particular silence of a person gathering themselves. Then she wrote, can you remove her name from your pages? This was the question I had been waiting for, the one everything else led toward. I considered my answer for exactly as long as was honest. I wrote, I did not know. I have never tried to remove a name. The ability was not described in my evolution notifications. I would need to attempt IT to find out. She wrote the question with the controlled directness of someone who had decided to negotiate in good faith. What do you want in exchange for the attempt? I wrote, I want 3 things. First, the transfer ritual is canceled permanently and the harvesting dungeon program is ended. She was very still reading the first condition, processing what it implied about what I knew. I continued writing without waiting. Second, the condemned names continue coming to me through the standard ritual. No changes to the process. No additional monitoring or restrictions placed on the book. Third, Lyra's soul is released from the Eastern Hold and the condemnation on her record is formally overturned. Not pardoned, overturned. There is a difference. She read all 3. Then, the third condition requires an admission that the original condemnation was unjust. That implicates court officials in a false judgment. I wrote, I am fully aware of what I am asking. That is precisely why IT is a condition and not a polite request. She wrote, you are asking me to expose a court conspiracy, and you are using my daughter's name in your pages as the leverage to make that happen. I wrote, I am asking you to correct an injustice against your daughter using an opportunity I am providing. How you frame IT internally is your business. She sat back. I could feel the weight of what she was holding, the decision, the implications, the particular position of a powerful person being asked to use their power for the right thing. After a long time, she wrote, the first 2 conditions are within my authority to arrange. The third requires the king's seal. I wrote, I am aware of that requirement. I have been patient for 3.5 years. I am prepared to wait a little longer for IT. She set down her quill for a moment, then picked it up again and wrote a question that felt like it came from somewhere personal. How long have you been away? I wrote, 3.5 years. On a shelf in your archive. Classified as rank F and used as ceremonial furniture. She wrote, and in that time you have been sitting on a shelf. In this archive absorbing condemned names and planning this. I wrote, not planning this specifically. Planning to be prepared for whatever this turned out to be. There is a difference. She almost smiled. I couldn't see her face from inside my own pages, but I could feel the shift in the quality of her presence. Something relaxed fractionally. She read that and then wrote something that told me she had already been questioning Aldrich's account. Aldrich told me your tag still reads rank F. I wrote, my system tag reads rank F. My tag has not been updated since I was placed in this archive. Tags are assigned at acquisition and rarely revised. She looked at the page for a moment, then wrote with the directness of someone done with indirect approaches. What is your actual current rank? I wrote, sufficient for this conversation and for what comes after IT. And I left it there without elaboration. She read that word for a long and careful moment, taking its full meaning. Then she closed me, stood from the chair, and picked me up. She carried me back to my shelf on the 2nd level, near the east-facing window. She set me down with a precision that suggested she had noted exactly where I'd been. At the door of the archive, she stopped without turning around. She said to the room, to no one visible, in a voice just loud enough for the space, 10 days becomes 7. Then she left. The archive's ordinary sounds resumed around her departure. Distant quills, settling wood, the quiet industry of people who had no idea what had just happened. Cale appeared at the base of the 2nd level stairs 20 minutes later. He looked up at my shelf. He held up 3 fingers, then pointed to himself, then pointed to me. 3 fingers. He had found 3 things worth reporting. He was going to tell me during the late hours after everyone had left. I waited without difficulty. He came to me during the archive's late hours, after everyone else had gone. He sat at the back table and opened me without preamble. Edrin agreed to meet. He is coming to the archive tomorrow evening as a visiting researcher. I arranged access through the standard visitor process. I absorbed that information and wrote back, good. That is useful. What else did you find in the restricted section? He wrote, the Eastern Hold has 17 prisoners. Lyra's soul is in the upper tier. Upper tier prisoners have access to supervised outdoor time twice daily. I wrote, and the third thing, the one you are clearly building toward because of how long you paused before starting. He was quiet for a moment. Then, The condemnation order for Lyra's soul was signed by 3 officials. Aldrich was the second signature. Varen's soul was the third. I sat completely still. Varen's soul had signed her own daughter's condemnation order. I read that sentence 3 times before I trusted my understanding of it. I wrote back to words that I needed to say out loud, even in ink. Before I could move past them, she signed it. He wrote, her signature is on the document. I found the original in the restricted records section. Aldrich filed it there after the condemnation was formalized. I wrote the question that was sitting directly underneath the fact, waiting to be asked. Why would she sign her own daughter's condemnation order? He wrote, I don't know. Maybe she was forced. Maybe IT was the only way to keep Lyra from being executed outright. A condemnation with delayed sentencing is not the same as an execution order. I thought about that. About a powerful woman signing a document condemning her own daughter, knowing the book would hold the name and the execution wouldn't be carried out immediately. About a mother using a bureaucratic mechanism to buy time. About a woman who spent 3 years as first match carrying that signature in her own file. I wrote, she used the ritual to protect her. The condemnation went to the book. The execution order technically existed but was never scheduled. He wrote, that is what I think too. But if that is true, then she already knew what the book was before you revealed yourself to Aldrich. I processed it slowly. Then, she knew the book collected condemned names. She knew the transfer ritual drained IT on schedule. She used that schedule deliberately. He wrote, she put her daughter's name in the book knowing the transfer would happen before any execution order could be carried out. I wrote, and now I interrupted the transfer, which means Lyra's name is still in my PAGES, which means she is still officially condemned with nitrogen monoxide active execution schedule. He wrote, she is protected by the limbo state. As long as her name is in the book and the book is intact, the condemnation exists but cannot be fulfilled without the book's cooperation. I understood now why Varen's soul had come to me directly, why she had not waited for Aldrich's diplomatic process to play out. She had not come to negotiate the cancellation of the transfer ritual. She had come to confirm that the book understood the position her daughter was in. She had come to see if I was the kind of entity that would use the position as a weapon, or the kind that would understand what she had done and why. I wrote, she was testing me. The meeting today. She already knew most of what she asked about. She came to see how I responded to sensitive information. He considered everything I had just said about the meeting, then wrote with the understated directness I had come to rely on. Did you pass her test? I thought about the moment she had almost smiled, the fractional relaxation of her presence, the 7 days instead of 10. I wrote, I think so, and let myself sit with a particular satisfaction of being correctly read by someone who was genuinely trying to read me correctly. The next evening Edrin came. He was older than I had imagined from his fragment. I had pictured the young dark circle much more clearly than the person he'd become. Quieter now. The shaking hands were still. The dark circles had become permanent features of his face rather than signs of recent strain. He had the look of a man who had put something heavy down a long time ago and had never quite forgotten what it felt like to carry it. Kale brought him to the private reading room and then made a point of needing to organize scrolls in the adjacent corridor where he could hear everything. Edrin sat across from the table where Kale had set me. He looked at my cover for a long time without touching me. Then he reached out and opened me to the front page. He read the conversation there, or most of it, the parts I had opened to him. Then he took a breath and wrote with a slightly unsteady hand. You found IT. 2 words. The full weight of 4 years of carrying a secret pressed into both of them. I wrote, yes, I found what you pressed into the page. I have held IT since the day you wrote her name. I understand what IT cost you to write IT. He wrote, I tried to refuse. They told me if I did not sign the condemnation order, they would find someone else who would, and then include my name in the next batch. I wrote, I know. You were not given a choice. What you were given was the opportunity to leave a record of the truth. You took IT. That matters. He was still for a long moment, reading what I had written about his former colleague. Then he wrote carefully, why are you telling me all of this? I wrote, because I need your testimony, formal and on record, what you were ordered to do, who ordered IT, and what your actual assessment of Lyra Soul's guilt was. He wrote, giving the testimony would put me in front of the very officials who threatened me 4 years ago. I wrote, the situation has changed. Varen's soul is aware of what I am and is cooperating with the effort to overturn her daughter's condemnation. He wrote it back to me the way you repeat something to confirm you have understood it correctly. Varen's soul herself signed the condemnation order. I wrote, she did. to protect her daughter from immediate execution using the only mechanism available to her at the time. The mechanism was me. He was very still reading the implication of that. Then he wrote slowly. She used the book deliberately as a holding space for her daughter. I wrote, yes, and I interrupted the transfer that would have cleared the record and reset the execution timeline, which means Lyra's soul is currently in a protected legal limbo. He wrote, and your testimony, the book's testimony, combined with mine, plus Varen's soul's cooperation, could overturn the condemnation. I wrote, that is my current working theory, and I believe it is correct. The question now is simpler than all of that. Are you willing to testify? He did not answer immediately. He sat with his hands flat on the table on either side of me and looked at the page for a long time. Then he wrote, yes, one word, the same weight as two, delivered with the particular steadiness of someone who has been waiting for years for someone to ask. Cale came back into the room at that point, carrying scrolls he hadn't actually needed to organize. He looked at Edrin. Edrin looked at him. Some kind of assessment passed between them. Then Cale sat down across from Edrin and said, out loud, in the quiet private room, tell me everything. I will write it down properly this time. I sat on the table between them and held the space as they worked. Cale asked careful questions. Edrin answered them with the precision of someone who had rehearsed these answers in private for years. By the end of the session, the testimony was fully documented in Cale's careful hand, covering every detail Edrin could provide, not in my pages, in a separate formal record that Cale filed under a research notation designed not to attract immediate official attention. On the 8th day, Aldrich came back, not to the archive. He sent a written message through the standard court channels to the archive's receiving desk. Cale brought it to me that evening. He opened me and placed the message flat against my pages so I could read it. The text was brief and formal. The Senior Mage Council has reviewed the situation as described by Aldrich of the Court Mage Division. The Council has agreed in principle to the proposed arrangement. Conditions 1 and 2 are accepted. Condition 3 requires a formal process that will take additional time. The Council requests patience on this point. The Council also requests that the book's current situation and capabilities remain confidential pending the formalization of the arrangement. I read it. Then I wrote to Cale. Accepted in principle is not the same as accepted. Condition 3 has nitrogen monoxide timeline. Patience on this point means indefinitely if they can arrange it. Cale read the Council's message carefully and then wrote, accepted in principle with nitrogen monoxide timeline on condition 3. What do you want to do about that? I wrote, right back, tell Aldrich that the arrangement is accepted in principle on OUR end as well, and that condition 3 will be completed within 30 days or the arrangement is void. He wrote back with the particular caution of someone checking that he had understood the request correctly. You want to set a 30-day deadline. On A King's seal, I wrote, I want to set a deadline on their good intentions. Good intentions without timelines are just intentions. I have been patient for 3.5 years. 30 days is generous. Cale wrote back to Aldrich. The response came the following morning, also brief and formal. The 30-day timeline was accepted. That evening, Varen's soul came to the archive again. She didn't take me from my shelf this time. She simply stood at the base of the second-level stairs and looked up. I couldn't look back. I had no eyes, but I was aware of her presence the way I was aware of everything in the archive. Completely. Continuously. Without having to try. She stood there for a moment. Then she said, quietly, to the air in general, Edrin has agreed to testify. That was unexpected. She waited. I wrote on my front page where she couldn't see it. For my own record, she expected to do this alone. Then she said, I want you to know that when this is finished, I intend to revisit the question of what you actually are and what your presence in this archive means. She paused. That is not a threat. It is a notice of intent. You have earned the right to know what is coming. She left. I sat in the dark that followed her departure and thought about what it meant to be noticed by someone who had just decided to take you seriously, not as a threat to be contained, not as a tool to be used, as a thing with its own trajectory that needed to be understood on its own terms. 3 more condemned names arrived during the final week of the 30-day period. 3 more seeds. 3 more fragments. Weldsorn. Assault on a mage of the court. Condemned. His 12 years as a city guard, unglamorous and methodical, settled into my pages. RIVA Cross. Theft of classified documents executed. Her particular understanding of archive organization, ironic given my location, became mine. Peldoran. Desertion under fire. Condemned. His knowledge of the city's lower districts, earned 3 years of patrol, joined everything else. 553 units of soul force. 311 absorbed individual fragments. A library inside a library, growing silently. On the 28th day, Kale came to my shelf carrying a document he held with both hands the way you hold something that is simultaneously important and fragile. He brought it to the back reading table, opened me, set it beside me. I read it carefully, fully, without rushing. It was a formal court order, sealed with the king's own seal, which I recognized from Harlanor's fragment of court procedure knowledge. As the gold and black impression, the order formally overturned the condemnation of Lyra Sol, daughter of Varen Sol, first mage of the court of Valethorn. The original condemnation was declared a procedural error. No admission of deliberate injustice, no names of the officials who had pressured Edrin, but an overturning, formal and permanent, with the king's seal attached. Kale set the document down beside me and wrote in his small careful letters, "IT is done. The king's seal is on IT. The condemnation is formally overturned." I wrote back, yes, the same word he had written to me, but with everything that had happened between then and now behind IT. He wrote the question with the careful neutrality of someone who genuinely did not know what the right answer was. Are you going to remove her name from your pages now? I sat with that question for a long time, longer than I had sat with most things. Then I wrote back honestly. I wrote, I did not think I can remove any name. I tried 3 days ago when I knew this document was coming. The names do not leave. They are part of what I am now. He wrote, you told Varen Sol you genuinely did not know whether you could remove a name. That was 3 weeks ago. What changed? I wrote, that was accurate at the time. I genuinely did not know. Now I do. The answer is no. Nothing written in me leaves. He absorbed the answer and then wrote the follow-up that anyone careful would ask. What does that mean in practical terms for Lyra Sol specifically? I wrote, IT means her condemnation still exists as a record inside me, but the legal condemnation has been overturned. The record in my pages is a separate thing. He wrote, is IT dangerous to her? A condemned name sitting in a soul book that absorbs soul force from the deceased. I wrote, she is alive. The absorption only activates on confirmed death. As long as she lives, her entry in my pages is I-N-E or T. It cannot harm her. He wrote it carefully, the way you write something you need to understand but would prefer not to think about it directly. And when she eventually dies, years from now, I wrote, then I will absorb what she had, just like everyone else. That is what I am. I let that sit there without apology. He read it. He didn't write anything for a while, sitting with the honesty of the answer. Then he wrote, does that bother you? Knowing what you are. I wrote, I think about IT. I do not know if bother is the right word. IT is simply what is true about what I am. I am learning to hold what is true without deciding how I feel about IT first. He wrote back with a dry precision that I had come to recognize as his version of genuine affection. That is either very wise or very concerning. Possibly both. I wrote, probably both. And that was, I had learned, usually the most honest answer to questions about my nature. On the 29th day, Lyra Sol was released from the Eastern Hold. Kale learned this through the Archive's official notification system. He came to my shelf immediately and stood in front of me for a moment before taking me down. When he opened me, he wrote just one word, FRE. He wrote it in slightly larger letters than usual, the way you write something you have been waiting a long time to write. I held the word the way I had held thousands of names, but differently, the way you hold something that has been waiting a long time to exist. I wrote back, yes, and then I wrote something I hadn't planned to write, something that came from deeper in my pages than the tactical knowledge or the magical theory. I wrote, this is the first thing I have done in this form that I am certain was worth doing. That is useful to know about myself. He read that, didn't respond immediately. After a while he wrote, I think there will be more of them. I wrote, I think so too. And the morning light came through the east-facing window and fell across my cover. That same afternoon, Varen Sol came to the archive for the 3rd time. She came up to the 2nd level and stood at my shelf. She did not take me down. She did not open me. She simply placed one hand flat against my cover and held it there for a moment. I felt the contact, the warmth of it. Whatever sensing technique she ran this time found something different than what she'd found 3 days into our acquaintance. I had not hidden anything in that touch. I had let whatever I was be readable to whatever she was capable of reading. It seemed like the right gesture given the occasion. She took her hand away, said, quietly, the arrangement holds. The transfer ritual is permanently canceled. The condemnation records will continue as usual. She paused, then, and I will be returning, not to negotiate, to learn what you are, on whatever terms you are willing to offer. She walked back to the archive's main stairs. At the top she stopped and turned just enough to address my general direction. "My daughter asked to know your name," she said. I told her I did not know it. She would like to know, "Do you have one that you use?" I had not been asked that before. I sat with it for a moment. Then I used a passive inscription on a small slip of paper I had been given for practice purposes. Kale materialized from between the shelves. He had an instinct for appearing when I needed him, saw the slip, picked it up, and brought it to her. She read what I had written, a single word, not a name I had been given, a name I had chosen for myself during the long quiet years of learning what I was. She read what Kale had brought her. She looked up toward my shelf once more with an expression I could not see, but could feel the quality of. Then she left without saying the name aloud. The name was mine. The archive was my territory. The court had agreed to feed me. My evolution was ongoing, and somewhere in the city of Valethorn, a healer named Lyra's soul was walking out of the eastern hold into the afternoon light, alive and legally free. I had done that, from a shelf, as a book, classified as rank F on a tag that no one had thought to update in for years. I was starting to understand something about what power actually was and how it actually moved in the world. It was not always loud. It was not always visible. It did not always announce itself with system notifications and rank promotions and dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it was patient. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it sat on a shelf for years and absorbed everything it was given and waited for exactly the right moment. I had 553 units of soul force. I had 311 absorbed fragments from individuals who had lived full and complicated lives. I had an alliance with the First Mage. I had a testimony on file that could, if needed, expose a core conspiracy. I had Kale, who knew everything and said nothing. I had a name, and I was still rank C on a system that hadn't caught up to what I actually was, and still labeled F on a tag that the court hadn't bothered to update. Could not let them underestimate. Let them think the arrangement they had negotiated was a concession to a contained and manageable anomaly. Let them bring their condemned names to me and perform their little ritual, and feel the comfortable certainty of having handled the situation properly. Every name they brought me was a gift. Every confirmed death was another unit of soul force, another fragment, another piece of the thing I was building in the dark. The First Mage wanted to return and learn what I was. I would let her. I would show her what I chose to show her, and hold back what I chose to hold back. And underneath everything, underneath the arrangements and the alliances and the names filling my pages, and the soul force accumulating, something else was growing. The system's evolution path was still partially classified. I still did not know what rank C led to, or what conditions triggered the next stage, or what lay beyond it, but I could feel the outline of it, the way you can feel a door in a dark room before your hand touches the handle. Something vast and patient and not yet ready to be named. I had been a book for years. I had been awake for all of it. I had been building for all of it, and I was still rank C on a system that hadn't caught up, and still rank F on a tag that no one had bothered to update. I was only just getting started. If you want to know what name I chose for myself, drop it in the comments. I'll tell you if you're right. 5 years. That is how long it took for everything to change in ways I had not fully predicted, which is saying something given how much I had predicted. 5 years after Lyra's soul walked out of the Eastern Hold, I had accumulated 947 units of soul force. 5 years of condemned names arriving on schedule. 5 years of fragments building on fragments. 5 years of the archive's morning light on my cover. The arrangement held. The transfer ritual was canceled permanently. The condemned names kept coming. The court kept feeding me without knowing what it was feeding. I had evolved twice more in those 5 years. Both times quietly. Both times on a Tuesday, which I had decided was simply the day the universe preferred for significant events. Soul book rank, C to B. New ability unlocked, projection. Host may generate a visible manifestation of written text visible to chosen observers. Soul book rank, B2A. New ability unlocked, voice. Host may produce audible speech within a radius of 10 meters. Duration scales with soul force, a voice. After 5 full years of communicating exclusively through ink pressed onto pages, I could produce actual audible sound. I did not use it immediately. I sat with it for 3 full days, the way I had sat with every significant development, and I thought carefully about what it meant. Then on the 4th day I waited until Kale came to my shelf for his morning check, and I said, out loud, in the quiet archive, "Good morning." He dropped the stack of scrolls he was carrying. All of them, 12 scrolls in various states of organization, scattered across the 2nd level floor. He stood there looking at me. Then he looked at the 12 scrolls on the floor, then back at me, with the expression of someone recalibrating. Then he said, in a voice that was remarkably steady given the circumstances, "You have been saving that for effect, haven't you?" I said, 3 days. I wanted to be certain the ability was stable before using it. I thought that was a reasonable delay. He picked up the scrolls. He took longer than necessary, which I understood was because he needed the time. Then he stood up and said, "We should probably talk about what this changes." I said, "It changes the speed and ease of our conversation significantly. It does not change anything fundamental. I am still a book on a shelf." He said, "You are a book on a shelf that can now speak out loud and make junior archivists drop 12 scrolls on a second-level floor." I said, "I will work on my delivery. Though I know that the scroll situation was at least partially your own fault for not expecting this." He almost smiled. He had a particular almost smile that I had learned to recognize over 5 years of watching his expressions from the angle of a shelved book. It meant he was genuinely pleased about something and was being careful not to show it directly, which was how Cale expressed most of the things he genuinely felt. The voice changed things more than I had anticipated, not in the ways I had planned for. The strategic advantages, the expanded communication range, the ability to address rooms. It changed things in smaller ways that accumulated. The quality of conversations, the texture of being understood without the intermediary of ink on paper. Varen's soul came to the archive the day she heard about it. She had informants among the junior archivists, which I had known for some time and considered entirely reasonable. She came up to the second level and stood at my shelf and said, without preamble, "So, you have found your voice." I said, "I have had this ability for 11 days now. I have been practicing on Cale and 3 pigeons that use my window ledge." She said, 11 days of practice and no one thought to mention it. On whom, exactly, have you been practicing your new voice? I said, "Cale, primarily, and 3 pigeons that land on the window ledge. They are not impressed, but they are consistent." She was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone choosing how to say a thing they have been holding for a while. Then, "My daughter would like to visit." I had been expecting this for approximately 2 years and had not mentioned it, which meant she had been waiting to see if I would bring it up first. I said, "She is welcome. I would like to meet her. I have held her name for over 4 years, and I owe her something I cannot entirely define." Varen said, "She does not know the full details of how her situation was resolved, only that a court procedure cleared her record." I said, "That is your choice and hers to make. I will not mention what I know unless she asks directly, and if she asks directly, I will tell her the truth." Varen said, "I expected you to say that." She paused. "It is one of the things I find both useful and inconvenient about you." I said, "I have found that being predictably honest has significant strategic advantages over the alternative." She said, "Yes, I have noticed." And there was something in how she said it that told me she was speaking about herself as much as about me. Lyrisol came to the archive on a rainy Thursday, accompanied by Cale, who had met her at the main entrance and was now doing a very poor impression of someone conducting a routine tour. She was smaller than I had imagined from her mother's presence, quieter. She moved through the archive the way people move through places that have been described to them, but never visited. She came up to the second level and stood in front of my shelf. She looked at my cover for a long time without speaking. Then she said something that landed differently than anything her mother had said to me. "Despite covering the same facts, you held my name for 4 years." I said, "Yes, I am saying the vault book may be in territory. The classification system was never designed to measure, which changes the risk profile considerably." She said, "I want to ask you something. Did it hurt? The condemnation? I mean, for you, being the thing that carried it all that time." I had not been asked that before. I sat with it for a moment, giving it the honest consideration it deserved, and then I said, "It felt heavier than the others. Your name always sat differently." I did not understand why for a long time. She said, quietly, but without question in her voice, the way people say things they have been certain of for a long time, "Because I wasn't guilty." I said, "Partially, and partially because the person who wrote it didn't believe you were guilty, and that doubt was part of the entry." It changed the texture. She was quiet for a moment, processing what I had said about the quality of doubt in the writing. Then she said one word, "Edrin." I said, "Yes, I am saying the vault book may be in territory the classification system was never designed to measure, which changes the risk profile considerably." She said, "I was told a court procedure cleared my record." but I heard Edrin's name mentioned in connection with it. I did not know the full details. I said, he was very brave. He had been carrying what he knew for 4 years before anyone gave him a reason to put it down. She said, he carried it for 4 years without telling anyone. I would very much like to find him and thank him properly for that. I said, he would appreciate it significantly. He is in the lower city now, working as a healer's assistant. Kale can find you the address. From somewhere in the adjacent stacks, Kale's voice said with the timing of someone who had been listening carefully throughout. I already wrote it down. He materialized from between the shelves with the particular timing of someone who had been listening carefully throughout the whole conversation. Lyra looked at him, then at me, then back at him. She said, how long have the two of you been doing this? Kale said, with the easy certainty of someone stating a fact he has never needed to calculate, 5.5 years, more or less continuously. She said, looking between the shelf and the junior archivist with an expression that was half disbelief and half something warmer. And you just talk. As partners? I said, I prefer allies. Partners implies a more formal arrangement than we have ever bothered to establish. Kale said, we have never established anything formally. There was no agreement, no arrangement. It simply became the situation over time. I said, we established everything informally over 5.5 years of ink on paper, and one conversation about whether I was afraid. Lyra looked between us again. Then she said something I had not expected. Can I come back? Not for anything specific, just to be here sometimes. I said, yes, the archive is open to researchers with appropriate credentials. Kale can arrange yours. She said, I appreciate that, but I should tell you, I am a healer, not a researcher. I do not have any legitimate research credentials to present. I said, you were condemned for aiding enemies of the crown, and your record was overturned on procedural grounds. The archive has considerably stranger regular visitors. She smiled. It was her mother's smile in structure but warmer in execution, which told me something about the difference between what Varin had become and what Lyra had stayed. She came back the following week, and the week after, and gradually, over the months that followed, she became a fixture of the archive's afternoons. She sat at the reading tables and worked on medical documentation. She asked Kale questions about archive organization that he answered with genuine enthusiasm. Occasionally, she came up to the second level and stood at my shelf and we talked about the names in my pages, about what I had learned from each of them, about the healer's knowledge that had accumulated from the 3 medical practitioners whose names had been written into me over the years. She was interested in that specifically, the fragments of medical knowledge. She said that some of what I described matched techniques she hadn't encountered in standard training. I described what I had. She wrote it down. It became a kind of ongoing collaboration that neither of us had planned and that both of us found genuinely useful. On one of those afternoons, she said, does it bother you that my name is still in your pages? That it will always be there? I said, I thought about how to answer the question for a long time before you asked it. What I arrived at is this. Your name is part of what I am. The names do not leave. She said it with the calm of someone who has thought about mortality more carefully than most people her age. And when I die, eventually, years from now, I said, then I will absorb what you had. Your experience, your knowledge, whatever fragments remain, the same as everyone else. She was quiet for a long moment, sitting with the image I had offered. Then she said, that is not as disturbing as it sounds like it should be. I said, I think it depends on how you think about continuity, whether you see it as an ending or as a kind of library. She said, with the particular precision of someone who has just understood something and wants to confirm it. You see yourself as a library. I said, I see myself as many things simultaneously. A library is one of the more accurate descriptions available in the current vocabulary. She said, with a particular directness that I recognize now as a family quality. What is the single most accurate description, if you had to choose? I sat with that question for a long moment, longer than most questions required, because it deserved more than a quick answer. Then I said, something that is still deciding what it is. Something that has accumulated enough to know that the accumulation is not finished. Something patient. She said, with a faint precision in her voice that sounded like her mother but warmer. That is 3 descriptions. You said if you had to choose. I said, yes. They are all accurate simultaneously, and I cannot currently separate them into a single cleaner answer. That is the honest response. She said, HM, and that was the end of the conversation, which was also Lyra's particular style. ending things when they had been said fully rather than when they had been said completely. The second significant event of the 5th year happened in autumn, when a man named Cale Dorn presented himself at the archive's main desk with a research request. I learned about him from Cale, who brought the request to me with the particular expression of someone who has found something interesting and is not yet sure if interesting is good. The request was for access to records relating to soul artifacts, specifically historical accounts of awakened soul artifacts and their documented capabilities. Cale wrote on a slip of paper and held it up to my shelf. He is rank AHUNTER, independent, not affiliated with the court. I wrote back on another slip of paper, because the question felt important enough to ask before making any decisions. What does he look like? Cale thought about that. Then he wrote, like someone who has been looking for something for a long time, and is starting to wonder if he's looking in the right place. I said, quietly so only Cale could hear, bring him up to the research section on the 2nd level, and stay nearby. Cale Dorn was a tall man with a particular economy of movement. That came from years of high-rank dungeon work. He moved like he was always assessing exits. He sat at the reading table with the documents Cale had pulled for him, and worked through them methodically, making notes in a small book he kept in his left coat pocket. He had been working steadily for approximately 2 hours when he stopped writing mid-sentence, and looked up directly at my shelf. Not a glance, not the casual eye drift of someone letting their gaze wander. A direct, deliberate look, like someone who had already decided to look before they looked. He said to the shelf, not to the room, not to Cale who was nearby, directly to the shelf, without any drama whatsoever. I know you are awake, I said, using my voice for the first time with someone who was not Cale or Varin Soul or Lyra. What gave it away? I am curious to know. He did not startle. He had been expecting a response, which told me a great deal about how thoroughly he had prepared for this visit. He said, the documents I requested do not exist anywhere in the standard archive system. Someone pulled them from a restricted section. He continued, they were filed under a research notation. That does not match any standard cataloging convention I have encountered in 8 years of dungeon work. He paused. The notation reads, reference material, ongoing inquiry, authorized by archive standing account. There is no standing account with that authorization level in the official records. I checked before I made the research request. The authorization does not legitimately exist. I said, Cale has a considerable gift for administrative creativity. He has been doing it for 5.5 years and has never been caught. He said, his pen still in his hand, his notes still in front of him, his full attention now entirely on my shelf. And you have been in this archive for how long? I said, 5.5 years. Classified as rank F on a tag that has not been updated since the day the previous librarian shelved me. He said, during which time you have been classified as rank F and used as a ceremonial prop for court condemnation rituals, without anyone noticing. I said, that is correct. The gap between the tag and the reality has been consistently and specifically useful to maintain. He said it with a flat certainty of someone stating something they already knew. When they walked in, you are not rank F, not even close. I said, my tag has not been updated since the day I was acquired. Tags are assigned at acquisition and rarely revised without specific reason. He said, I have encountered 3 awakened artifacts in my career. 2 of them were extremely dangerous and 1 of them was merely very dangerous. None of them talked. I said, I have had a voice for approximately 3 months. Before that I communicated through written text. It was slower but adequate. He set down his pen. He leaned back in his chair and looked at my shelf with the expression of a man adjusting a significant number of prior calculations. He set down his pen. He sat back from the table. He looked at my shelf with the expression of a man who had planned this question. Then, what do you want? I said. That is the question everyone eventually asks me. I have given many versions of the answer. The most recent accurate version is, to finish becoming what I am becoming. He said it quietly, leaning forward slightly, with a specific interest of someone who has been looking for something and senses they are getting close. Which is what? I said. I do not fully know yet, but I know it requires continued accumulation and continued evolution. And I know this archive is the right place for both. He said it not as a question, but as a confirmation of something he had already worked out. From the documents in front of him, you are accumulating soul force from condemned names. I said, yes. I am saying the vault book may be in territory the classification system was never designed to measure, which changes the risk profile considerably. He said, and the court mages, The people who have been bringing those names to you, they know what you are and have formally accepted the situation. I said, we reached an arrangement approximately 4 years ago. The transfer ritual that was meant to drain me has been permanently canceled. He said, the court mages agreed to that arrangement, which means they got something in exchange. What did you offer them that was worth the concession? I said, confidentiality and the correction of a specific injustice, both of which have been fulfilled. He was quiet for a moment. Then I came here looking for information about awakened artifacts because I encountered something in a dungeon 3 months ago that I cannot explain. I said, describe what you found, completely, in as much detail as you can recall. Start with the vault layout and work inward from there. He said, a book, sealed in a vault in a dungeon approximately 40 miles northeast of the capital. Rank unknown. The system could not read it. Pages filled with names. He paused. It was writing new names by itself. I watched it happen. A blank page filled with text while I was standing in the room with it. I was very still. Not physically. I was always physically still, but in the internal way that meant something had just rearranged my understanding of a situation. I said, how many names were already written in those volumes? Give me your best estimate of the total pages and the density of entries. He said, hundreds at minimum, possibly significantly more. The vault had 3 chambers and multiple volumes on stone shelves that had been purpose-built. I said, and the names, were they condemned individuals, criminal records, executed prisoners, or did they come from a different population entirely? He said, no, the names I could read were ordinary people, merchants, farmers, a child, no criminal notations. I said, how old was the dungeon structure? The architecture should give you an approximate date range for when the vault was constructed and the books placed. He said, the dungeon structure dated to approximately 200 years ago based on the architecture. The books could have been there the entire time. 200 years. A sole book writing names by itself after 200 years of accumulation. Writing ordinary names. Not condemned. Not criminals. I understood what that meant. Or I understood enough of it to know that it was significantly more serious than anything I had encountered in my 5.5 years. I said, the book you found is not like me. It did not start the way I started. It has been accumulating differently, from a different source, for a much longer time. He said it quickly, with a focused attention of someone who has just heard a distinction that changes the shape of everything. How do you know that? I said, because a soul book that writes names by itself has passed a threshold I have not reached yet. It is not recording the condemned. It is choosing its own subjects. He said, writing names of ordinary people. People who then die. That sounds considerably less like a neutral observation and more like a threat. I said, it is a concerning development. Whether it is a threat depends on what the book is choosing names for, and what happens to those people after their names are written. He was very still. Then, the child whose name I saw written, I checked. On my way here I checked. I said, and you said you checked on your way here. You went back to the city records. What did you find when you looked up the child? He said, she died 3 days after I found the vault. Accident, according to the city records. Fell from a second-story window. I sat with that, the particular weight of it. A child's name written in a book, and 3 days later a fall from a window. I said, you need to go back to the vault. I need the layout map, the volumes counted, and the names from the most recently written pages transcribed. He said, I know. I came here because I knew that before I came. I just needed to understand the situation well enough to know what to do when I got there. I said, and I need to know everything about it. The layout, the number of volumes, the age distribution of the names you could read, the dungeon's original designation. He said it with genuine curiosity, without hostility, in the way of someone encountering unexpected logic and wanting to understand it. Why does a book on a shelf in the Royal Archive need the vault's layout, the volume count, the name age distribution, and the dungeon's original designation? I said, because I have been accumulating knowledge from condemned individuals for 5.5 years for reasons that were not entirely clear to me until approximately 30 seconds ago. He said, and now that 30 seconds have passed and things are apparently clearer. What are they clearer into? What do you now think you were building toward? I said, now they are considerably clearer. Something has been building in the Northeast for 200 years, and I have been building here for 5.5. And I have been building here for 5.5. Whether that is coincidence or design I cannot yet determine, but finding out is the next necessary step. He said it the way you say something when the implication has arrived and you need to hear it confirmed out loud anyway. Designed by whom? Who would design something like this? I said, I do not know. But the next logical step is to find out. I paused. Will you work with me on this? He said, you are a book on a shelf with no ability to leave the archive. How exactly do you propose to work on something that is in a dungeon 40 miles from here? I said, I am a rank a soul book with 947 units of soul force and 311 accumulated knowledge fragments. I have a formal arrangement with the royal court, a voice I acquired 3 months ago, and an ally who has been with me in this archive for 5.5 years. I paused for effect, which was a new luxury the voice had given me that I was still learning to use well. I am also still classified as rank F on a tag that has not been updated. I find the gap between what the tag says and what I actually am to be consistently and specifically useful. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I have a partner. She is a 4th rank mage named Sora. We work together. I said, bring her when you come back. The more people with direct knowledge of that vault and what is inside it, the better our position when the time comes to act. He said, you are remarkably confident for something that cannot leave its shelf or move through the world under its own direction. I said, I have never needed to leave my shelf. In 5.5 years, everything I have needed has found its way to me. You included. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, all right, simple, direct. The same quality of commitment that Kale had shown 5.5 years ago when I had needed someone to say yes. He left the archive with his notes and his small book and his careful economy of movement. Kale appeared from between the shelves the moment the door closed. Kale appeared from between the shelves the moment the archive door closed behind Kale. He said, I heard most of the conversation. The important parts. I said, I know. You were not particularly hidden. The shelving you were pretending to organize was already organized when you started. He said, the vault book, the harvesting dungeons. Do you think they are related? Was the dungeon program built in response to what was already in that vault? I said, I think it is older than the harvesting dungeons. I think the harvesting dungeons may have been built in response to it, or as an imitation of it, or as a containment measure that failed. He said, if it has been writing ordinary names for 200 years and those people consistently die within a month of being written, I said, then it has been killing people for 200 years and no one has connected it. Because dungeon accidents and ordinary deaths and apparent misfortunes do not form a visible pattern. He was quiet for a moment with the arithmetic of it. Then, how many names in 200 years? If it has been doing this for 40 years minimum. I said, I do not know yet, but finding that number is one of the first things I intend to do. Once we understand the vault's full contents. Kale Dorn came back 6 days later with his partner Sora, who was a compact woman with the particular alertness of someone who had spent years in situations that required fast decisions. She looked at my shelf immediately upon reaching the 2nd level. With the directness of someone who had been briefed and was checking the briefing against reality. She said, you're the book. I said, yes, I am saying the vault book may be in territory. The classification system was never designed to measure, which changes the risk profile considerably. She said, Kale described you. He said you speak, you have an arrangement with the court mages, and you have been classified as rank F for 5 years. I said, I do. I have had the ability for 3 months. It has improved the efficiency of conversations considerably over the previous income paper method. She said, he also said you have an arrangement with the court mages and 900 units of soul force and you've been classified as rank F for 5.5 years. I said, 947 specifically, as of this morning. But the rest of what Kale described is approximately correct. She said, I have one question that I need answered before I decide whether I am involved in whatever this situation is. Just one. I said, ask it. I will answer it honestly regardless of how the answer affects your decision. That is the only way I know how to have this conversation. She said, the names in your pages, the condemned people whose soul force you have been absorbing for 5.5 years. Do you feel anything about them? I sat with that question and gave it the full weight it deserved. 5.5 years of names, fragments from over 300 individuals, people who had been judged, recorded, condemned, and in most cases killed. All of them present in my pages. All of them part of what I have become and continued to be. I said, yes, each one sits differently, some heavily, some with questions attached, some with a particular feeling of something that should not have happened the way it did. I paused. I hold them carefully. I think about what they knew and what they were before they became entries. I do not treat them as numbers. She looked at my shelf for a long time with an expression I categorized as settling, a person arriving at a decision they are comfortable with. Then, "All right, I'm in." Kale materialized from somewhere in the adjacent shelving and said, with the serenity of a man making an observation he has been holding for several minutes, "She is faster to commit than you were." I said, "You took 3 weeks of leaving messages on my front page before you decided to ask if I could hear you." He said, "I was being appropriately cautious. The situation warranted caution. A talking book is not something you rush into trusting." Sora looked between the shelf and the junior archivist with an expression that was reassessing several assumptions. She said, "How long have the two of you been doing this?" Kale and I said it at the same time, which was also something that had not happened before and which Sora appeared to find either charming or unsettling. 5.5 years. She looked between the shelf and the junior archivist. Then she said, "Right, tell me about the vault." What followed over the next weeks was the most concentrated period of incoming information I had experienced since the Warriors. Kale and Sora returned to the vault. They mapped it. 3 chambers, 47 volumes of varying ages, the oldest showing the brittle characteristics of paper that had been in existence for close to 2 centuries. They transcribed names and dates from as many volumes as they could access before the dungeon's internal systems began responding to extended human presence. Kale cross-referenced every name they brought back against the capital's death records, working systematically through the archive's population databases. The pattern was unmistakable once you were looking for it. Names written, deaths following within 3 to 30 days. Causes varying, accidents, illness, apparent misfortune. Nothing that would flag individually. Everything that connected into a continuous thread when you set the names beside the dates and looked at the two together. I said to Kale one afternoon, when they had brought the latest batch of cross-reference records, "This is not random. The distribution is not random. The deaths are not accidents." Kale said it the way you say something when you are certain and just needed to say it out loud. To confirm that certainty, something is choosing the names deliberately. I said, "Something is choosing the names. Whether someone is directing it or whether it is operating independently, I do not yet know." Sora said, "Can it sense us? After 2 visits with direct contact with the vault space, does it know that people have been in there looking at it?" I said, "Almost certainly. A soul book that has been accumulating for 200 years has perceptive capabilities that would make mine look minimal. It knows." Kale said, 2 visits and a 2-hour research session in the archive. If it can sense us and knows we are investigating, why hasn't it done anything yet? I said, "I do not know. Either it does not consider us a significant threat, or it is waiting, or it has reasons I cannot currently model." I paused before adding the part one had been considering since Kale first described the vault. Or it has already written our names and we simply do not know it yet. The silence that followed that statement had a particular quality. Kale looked at Sora. Sora looked at the floor. Kale looked at me. Then Kale said, from the particular stillness of someone who has just calculated a personal risk and is trying to decide how to feel about it, "Is there a way to check?" I said, "Not without going into the vault and reading the most recently written pages, which carries obvious risks." Kale said, "I can go back and read the most recent pages. I have been in there twice and know the layout well enough to reach the central chamber quickly." I said, "If your name is in the most recent entries, going back does not change that. If it is not, then going back is simply dangerous." Sora said, with the particular directness of someone done with theoretical discussion and ready for an actual plan, "Then what do we do? Tell me the specific next steps." I said, "We find the mechanism. Every soul book has an evolution path. Mine is driven by condemned names and confirmed deaths. The vault book source is different, ordinary names, ordinary deaths." I thought about it carefully before offering the hypothesis. What if the source is the dungeon itself rather than any specific ritual? What if the vault book has been absorbing soul force not from condemned individuals but from the dungeon's own ambient accumulation of death energy, continuously, for centuries? Kale said, "Dungeons collect death energy. Everyone knows that. It is why dungeons are dangerous. The accumulated force of everything that has died inside them." I said, "And a soul book placed inside a dungeon 200 years ago, before anyone knew what soul books could become, would have been absorbing the ambient force continuously." Sora said it back slowly, the way you repeat a number when you are trying to make it feel real and it keeps refusing to, for 200 years, continuously. I said, "Which would put its soul force accumulation at a level I cannot estimate with any confidence. and its evolution path would have followed a completely different trajectory than mine. Kale said, a soul book that evolves not from specific condemned names, but from ambient dungeon death energy. I said, would have no connection to any specific individuals, no fragments, no knowledge accumulation from particular people, but potentially enormous raw force. I paused, and at some point in that evolution, it began writing names, which suggests it developed the ability to reach outside the dungeon and affect the world it was sealed in. Kale said, a book that has been absorbing dungeon death energy continuously for 200 years is beyond any hunter protocol I have encountered. How do we stop it? I said, I do not know the mechanism yet, but I know where the answer is. And the answer is almost certainly somewhere in this archive, if we look in the right section. They all looked at me. I said, the person who put it there 200 years ago, or the records of that person, which are almost certainly in this archive somewhere. Kale was already moving toward the restricted section before I finished the sentence. The particular efficiency of someone who had been waiting for a direction to move in. He found the records 4 hours later, not in the main collection, in a sub-archive within the restricted section that he accessed through a door that had apparently been sealed for decades. The documents were old, very old, but legible. The archive's preservation conditions were excellent, which was one of the things I had come to genuinely appreciate about my location. Kale brought them to the second-level reading table and spread them out and read them in the silence of the late archive, with Kale and Sora and me all listening. The records described a project from 212 years ago. A royal mage named Harith Dovin, seeking to solve the problem of dungeon death energy accumulation. His theory had been elegant: place a soul artifact inside the dungeon to absorb the death energy before it could accumulate to dangerous levels. A natural drain, a passive safety mechanism. The artifact he had used was a book, a soul book of rank D at the time of placement, chosen for its passive absorption characteristics and its apparent harmlessness. Harith Dovin had died 14 years after placing the book in the vault. His project had been classified and then forgotten. The dungeon had been sealed. 212 years of continuous dungeon absorption followed. No oversight, no monitoring, no one checking what was happening inside the sealed vault. And then approximately 40 years ago, based on the pattern of deaths Kale had identified, the book evolved past whatever threshold produced the name-writing capability, and had been selecting names ever since quietly, consistently, within the pattern of ordinary misfortune, invisible unless you were looking. I said, Harith Dovin thought he was solving the dungeon death energy problem with an elegant passive solution. He created a 200-year catastrophe instead. Kale said, given everything you have just described, the accumulation timeline, the name writing, the consistent deaths, can it actually be stopped? I said, everything can be stopped. The question is what stopping it costs and what happens to the soul force it has accumulated if the book is destroyed. Sora said, you said the force release would be significant. Define significant. Give me a practical scale for what we are talking about here. I said, I do not know for certain, but a soul book at the rank this one has almost certainly reached cannot simply be destroyed without consequence. Destroying it without a controlled transfer of the accumulated force would release that energy uncontrolled. The release would be significant in ways I think you can calculate. Kale said, thousands of absorbed death events, 200 years of ambient dungeon force, uncontrolled release into the surrounding environment. How significant? I said, the 47 volumes. 200 years of dungeon ambient absorption, possibly thousands of individual death absorptions from the names it has written. I paused to let them work through the implications. If that force releases uncontrolled into the surrounding environment, the dungeon and everything within a significant radius would experience a soul force saturation event, accelerated mutation of any living things, possible dungeon expansion. Deaths. Kale said, accelerated mutation, dungeon expansion, deaths of anyone nearby, which means destroying it without a transfer vessel is not a real option. I said, accelerated mutation of any living things in the area, possible spontaneous dungeon expansion, certainly the deaths of anyone in the immediate vicinity. Sora said, so destroying it without a controlled transfer of the accumulated force would cause a localized catastrophe in the surrounding area. I said, not without a vessel to receive the force, something capable of absorbing it in a controlled way. The silence that followed had a different quality from the previous silences. Kale looked at my shelf. Sora looked at my shelf. Kale looked at my shelf. I said, yes, I am saying the vault book may be in territory the classification system was never designed to measure, which changes the risk profile considerably. Kale said, "You are proposing to absorb 200 years of accumulated soul force from a Dungeon Evolved soul book." I said, "I am proposing it as a possibility. I do not know if I am capable of it. I have 947 units. The Vault book has potentially thousands of times that." Sora said, "Would that be dangerous for you specifically? Absorbing that volume of force, what would it do to whatever you currently are?" I said, "Almost certainly, for whatever I currently am. Absorbing that volume of force would trigger an evolution I cannot predict. I might not remain what I currently am." Kale said it quietly, from somewhere near the adjacent shelves. "The way you ask a question when you already know you will not like part of the answer. What would you become?" I said, "I do not know. That is the honest answer. My evolution path has been classified since the beginning. I have never known what the next stage was until I reached it." He was quiet for a long time with that, long enough that Kale and Sora exchanged a glance. Then he said, "And you are willing to risk what you currently are?" I said, "I am willing to consider it seriously. I am not willing to commit to it without more information about the Vault book's current state and the control transfer mechanism." I paused. "Also, I would need to leave my shelf, which presents logistical challenges I have never previously needed to solve." Kale said it with the practical simplicity of someone who has decided the logistics are solvable and is not going to make them more complicated. "I can carry a book." I said, "You can carry a rank a soul book with 947 units of soul force into an active dungeon containing an evolved soul book of unknown rank and capability." He said, "When you list it out like that, the rank, the unknown adversary, the active dungeon, it does sound considerably more serious." I said, "Yes, I am saying the Vault book may be in territory the classification system was never designed to measure, which changes the risk profile considerably." Sora said, "Before anyone commits to anything involving an active dungeon and an unknown rank adversary, what specifically do we need to know first?" I said, 3 things. First, the Vault book's current evolution rank, which requires Kale and Sora to return to the Vault and attempt a rank reading. I continued, "Second, whether a control transfer mechanism exists in Harith Dovin's records, because he was a careful man and careful people make contingency plans." I continued, "Third, Varin Soul's assessment. She is the most powerful combat mage in the kingdom and she will be involved regardless of what we decide. So involving her now is more efficient." Kale said it with the quiet certainty of someone who has been Varin Soul's indirect contact point for years and knows exactly how to reach her. "I will talk to her." I said, "Thank you." Admit it with the full weight of 5.5 years of Kale handling the things I could not handle from a fixed position on a shelf. There was not a better or more accurate way to say it than that simple phrase, and I had learned not to reach for more words when the right ones were already present. Varin Soul came to the archive the following morning. At the time, Kale had indicated in his message to her, she came directly to the 2nd level. She stood and listened to everything without interrupting once, which I had learned over for years was specifically how she processed information. She considered genuinely important. When I finished, she said, "You are proposing to absorb the accumulated force of a Dungeon Evolved soul book of unknown rank." I said, "I am proposing it as one serious option among what may be several. I have been wrong about available alternatives before, and I will not assume I have found all of them." She said, "There are not other viable options. I have encountered 3 dungeon soul artifacts in my career. None were controllable by any standard means. Destruction releases the force uncontrolled. Containment requires constant active effort from a high-rank mage indefinitely. Neither ends the problem." She paused. "Absorption by a compatible vessel is the only clean solution. And compatible means another soul book." She looked at my shelf. "Which is you?" I said, "Yes. I am saying the Vault book may be in territory the classification system was never designed to measure, which changes the risk profile considerably." She said, "If the absorption triggers an uncontrolled evolution, if what comes out of that chamber is not what went in, I need to know your assessment of the risk." I said, "Then whatever I become is no longer what I currently am, and the arrangement we have may need to be renegotiated." She said, "Or you become something that I, as First Mage, would be professionally obligated to treat as a threat and attempt to contain." I said, "That is a possibility I am aware of. I am asking you to trust that what I have been for 5.5 years is a reasonable indicator of what I will choose to be afterward." She was quiet for a long moment with all of that. Then she said something that was not part of any negotiation. "My daughter trusts you completely." I said, "I know. She has told me. in her own way, over many afternoons at the reading table. It means something significant to me that she does. She said, that carries considerable weight with me, probably more than it should from a purely strategic standpoint, but I am aware of that and choosing it anyway. I said, it carries weight with me too, and that was also true in a way that I had not fully examined and was not entirely comfortable with, which probably meant it was important. Cale found the contingency plan in Harith Doven's records to days later, a control transfer protocol, developed by Doven and never used, designed for exactly this situation. It required for components, the target book, willing to receive, the source book, stable enough to allow the transfer to proceed without fragmentation, a channeling array, simpler than the ritual I had once disrupted, designed for drawing force inward rather than pushing it outward through an extraction channel, and a image of sufficient rank to hold the channel open during transfer. Rank as preferred. Rank as available. 1. Var Soul. She read the protocol from beginning to end without any expression I could detect. Then she set it down and said, Harith Doven was a very thorough man. I said, he was also dead within 14 years of creating the problem. But yes, he was thorough about the solution. She said it with a particular directness of a person who has made a decision and is now focused entirely on logistics. When? Give me the timeline. I said, when Cale and Sora return with the Vault Book's current rank and confirm the transfer site is accessible. She said, and after the transfer, if you evolve into something different, something the standard system cannot classify or predict, what happens then? I said, then I will still be me. I will still know everything I know. I will still hold every name in my pages. I will still have this conversation and my record. I paused before the last part, because it was the part one was most certain of. I do not know what else I will be, but I know what I will not stop being. She said, that is either genuinely reassuring or critically insufficient, and I cannot currently determine which one it is for certain. I said, probably both. That has been the most consistently honest answer to most important questions I have been asked over 5.5 years. Cale and Sora went back. They came back with a rank reading that made Sora's voice go flat when she reported it, which was how she communicated things she was still adjusting to. The Vault Book was rank as singular, the absolute highest point that the standard Hunter classification system was designed to measure. I said, the system cannot read past S, but the system was designed by people who assumed S was effectively the practical ceiling. They may have been wrong about that. Cale said, when the system returns a rank S reading on something that has been accumulating for 200 years, you are saying that S might not be the actual ceiling. I said, I am saying the classification system was designed by people who assumed S was effectively a ceiling. I have been evolving on a path those people did not design for. Sora said, so you might be walking into an absorption attempt against something that is beyond the highest ranked entity in the standard system. I said, yes, I am saying the Vault Book may be in territory. The classification system was never designed to measure, which changes the risk profile considerably. Sora said, the system maxes out at S and you are planning to absorb its accumulated force anyway. How are you not fundamentally concerned about that? I said, I am concerned about it, but concern and refusal are different responses to the same information. I have been building towards something I could not fully see for 5.5 years. I paused. This is what I was building toward. I did not know it until Cale walked in with his research request, but it has been true since before I knew it. The day we went to the vault was a Tuesday. I noticed that and appreciated it, because Tuesdays have been the day for significant events throughout my existence. Cale carried me. He had been carrying me for years in the archive, moving me between shelves, bringing me to reading tables, returning me to the east-facing window. Carrying me into a dungeon was a different category of the same action, which was either profound or ordinary depending on how you looked at it. I chose ordinary. The vault was everything Cale had described. 3 chambers, 47 volumes arranged on stone shelves that had been purpose-built for them. A stillness that was not peaceful but waiting. The Vault Book was in the central chamber, on a stand that looked like it had been placed there as part of the original installation. It was larger than me, older. The cover had the texture of something that had absorbed too much of something for too long. It was writing when we arrived, a name appearing on the open page, letter by letter, in ink that seemed to come from nowhere. We watched it finish, then it stopped. The new name sat on the open page, ink settled, room silent, and the Vault Book held its position on the stand without any further movement. I said to the Vault Book, because it was awake and had been awake longer than I had and deserved to be addressed directly. I know what you are. I know what you have been doing. Nothing in the room responded. The vault book did not write another name. The silence held. I decided that counted as a form of acknowledgement. I said, you were placed here to solve a problem. You solved it, and then you became something that created a new problem. That is not your fault, but it is the situation. I paused. I am here to offer a resolution. Not destruction, transfer. Your accumulated force moves to me. Your writing stops. The name stopped. Whatever I become, after is what I become. The vault book was still. Then, very slowly, a single word appeared on the page that already held the new name ready. A single word appearing slowly on the page, in the same ink and the same handwriting as every other name it had written. One word of response. Varen's soul began the channeling array. Kale stepped back. Kale and Sora positioned themselves at the chamber's edges as Varen had instructed. I felt the channel open. The connection between my pages and the vault book's pages, mediated by Varen's extraordinary precision and the 200-year-old protocol of a careful deadmage. And then, without any further preamble for either of us, the transfer began. Varen's soul held the channel and the two books faced each other across the vault. I will not describe the transfer in detail because I do not have language adequate to the description, and I think that is appropriate. I will say it lasted approximately 11 minutes, and that during those 11 minutes I understood things I had not understood in 5.5 years of quiet accumulation. I understood the difference between accumulation and saturation, between growing and filling, between being a vessel and becoming something a vessel cannot contain. I understood why the vault book had started writing ordinary names to centuries into its existence. Not malice, not any deliberate external design, simply the natural consequence of a thing that had absorbed more than its original form, could contain or direct, finding the only available outlet for the pressure. I understood that I was going to change in ways I could not fully predict before they actually happened, that what emerged from this chamber would not be classifiable by the standard system, that my rank F tag was about to become even more profoundly wrong than it had already been for years. And underneath all of that understanding, I held everything I had always held. The names, the fragments, 5.5 years of Kale's questions in ink, Lyra's soul's heavier than the other's entry, Varn's willingness, Edrin's press word, Kale's directness, Sora's one right question at the right moment, Varen's soul's willingness to trust, Edrin's press word, Kale's directness, Sora's single right question. All of it still present in my pages. All of it still mine. All of it still the particular accumulated thing that I had spent 5.5 years becoming. The transfer completed. The vault book's pages went still. The light in the chamber changed in a way that I noticed and could not describe. Varen's soul released the channel and stepped back and looked at me in Kale's hands with an expression that was the most unguarded thing I had ever perceived from her. I said, first thing, because it was the first thing that needed to be confirmed for everyone present, I am still here. I am still the same entity that entered this chamber. She looked at me for a long moment with an expression I had never seen from her before. Then she said, yes, I can see that. What else are you now, beyond still here? I thought about how to answer that accurately. The system notifications were still forming, not yet resolved into text I could fully read. Something in my pages was settling the way sediment settles after water has been disturbed, slowly, fully, permanently, into a configuration that would not be temporary. I said, something that is still deciding, same as before, but with considerably more to decide with. Kale said it from very close, with the particular quality of someone who has been holding a question for 11 minutes, and is now finally allowed to ask it, are you all right? I said, yes, I am saying the vault book may be in territory. The classification system was never designed to measure, which changes the risk profile considerably. He said, that is either straightforwardly true, or it is the beginning of something considerably more complicated. I cannot tell which yet. I said, probably both, and the word landed the same way it always did, which meant something important had not changed. The system notification resolved 3 days later, when we were back in the archive and the east-facing window was letting in the morning light and everything was quiet. Soul book rank, A2 unclassified. Standard classification system insufficient. New designation, Chronicle. Host status, fully autonomous. New ability unlocked, Manifestation. Host may generate physical form at will. Duration and form scale with intention. I read it, then I read it again. Then I set it aside and looked at the morning light on my cover and thought about what fully autonomous actually meant. It meant the arrangement with the court was now a choice I was actively making rather than a compromise I was maintaining for strategic reasons. The shelf was now a preference rather than a limitation. Everything from this point forward was decided by me, with no system pathway or external structure guiding what came next. I said to Kale, who was sitting at the reading table below with a cup of something warm and a stack of documents. He was only pretending to organize. I have a new classification. He said it with the careful patience of a person who has learned not to push, but who is clearly and completely focused. What is the new classification? I said, Chronicle. It says the standard classification system is insufficient. The new designation is Chronicle. Status listed as fully autonomous. He was quiet for a moment with those words. Then he said it, the question that had existed between us in various forms for 5.5 years. Does that mean you can leave the shelf? I said, it means I can generate a physical form at will. Duration and form scale with intention, according to the notification. The shelf is now a choice. He said it with the understated precision of someone for whom understatement had become a primary mode of communicating things that were actually very large. I said, no, it is not a small thing. It is possibly the largest thing that has happened to me since the night I woke up in this form and read my first system notification. He said, are you going to generate a physical form? Now that you can, today or in the near future. What does that look like in terms of your actual plans? I sat with that question. The particular texture of a choice that has been building for 5.5 years and has finally arrived as an actual option rather than a theoretical one. I said, not immediately. I have been on this shelf for 5.5 years and accumulated everything I am from this fixed and specific position. I would like to think carefully about what it means to be something capable of movement before I actually move. That seems like the appropriate order in which to do things. He said, that is very specifically and recognizably you. Acquiring a significant new capability and immediately deciding to think carefully about it before using it. I said, yes. I am saying the vault book may be in territory the classification system was never designed to measure, which changes the risk profile considerably. He said, the names, the condemned names that the court mages bring, the arrangement, you will continue to absorb them even with the new classification. I said, yes, that is what I am at the most fundamental level. A new classification does not change the foundation of how I accumulate and what I do with it. He said, the vault book's 200 years of accumulated force, all of it transferred, all of it absorbed. That is all in you now, integrated into what you are. I said, all of it. 200 years of ambient dungeon absorption. Thousands of ordinary deaths whose names were written and whose force was collected. I paused. They are part of me now, the same way the condemned names are part of me. I hold all of it. He said it the way you say something when the description is accurate, but also completely inadequate for the scale of what it is describing. That is an enormous amount of weight. I said, yes, but I have been practicing holding weight for 5.5 years. I think I can manage. He smiled, the full smile, not the almost smile, which I had seen only a handful of times in 5.5 years and had always found worth noting. He asked it the same way he had been asking versions of the question for 5.5 years. Not as a test, not as pressure, just as genuine interest in the answer. I said, we find the names in the vault book's pages that belong to living people. The ones written most recently. We find those people and we warn them. He said, the writing has stopped. The force was transferred. Those names may no longer carry the same consequence. I said, perhaps. But they were written. They exist in those pages. I will not leave them unaddressed. He said, of course not. The way you say something when you knew it was coming and are not surprised and are also not disappointed. I said, and after that, we figure out what a chronicle actually is. What it is designed for, what fully autonomous means for something that started classified as a prop, in a world that still has condemned names arriving on schedule, in an archive where my tag still reads rank F. Starting with those questions seems like the right beginning. He said, finding the people whose names were most recently written, warning them, and also determining the full nature of a chronicle. That sounds like the beginning of something very long. I said, most good things are. The things worth building take time. That has been true of everything I have done in this archive, from the first condemned name onward. The morning light was on my cover. The archive was quiet around us. Somewhere below, through the archive's ordinary sounds, Lyra's soul was letting herself in with the key Kale had arranged for her. Varen's soul had 3 more condemned names arriving this week. Kale and Sora were compiling the list of vault book names from their transcriptions. Edrin was working as a healer's assistant in the lower city, according to the most recent information Kale had gathered. That seemed like exactly the right place for him. The right work for a man who had spent for years carrying something too heavy and had finally been given a real reason to set it down for good. My tag still read rank F. No one had updated it in 5.5 years. I had decided, deliberately and completely, to leave it exactly as it was. The gap between what a tag says and what is actually inside the container is, after all, the most useful space I have ever found to work in. And I had only just begun to understand the full scope of what working patiently in that space, over enough time, with enough names, could eventually build.